My name is Clara Harding. I am 33 years old. For 8 years, I quietly paid every single debt my husband created, sacrificing my own peace of mind to keep our family afloat. Then he looked me in the eyes and sneered that I would die, broke without him. He never imagined I earned $740,000 a year, or what happened after I finally revealed the truth. Before I tell you how I legally dismantled his entire life and took back my power, please take a moment to like and subscribe if you enjoy stories about standing up for yourself. And drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I love reading your comments. Now let me take you back to the evening that finally shattered the illusion of my marriage. It was a cold, rainy Tuesday in suburban Ohio. I was sitting at my kitchen table staring at a piece of heavy yellow paper that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. It was a final repossession notice for my husband Thomas and his customized Ford F-150. The bold red letters at the top of the page threatened to tow his prized possession by midnight if the past due balance was not paid in full. This was not a surprise. Thomas loved looking wealthy, but he absolutely despised the actual hard work required to build wealth. He had spent thousands of dollars on custom rims and lifted suspension for that truck, completely ignoring the actual monthly payments required to keep it. My hands were trembling not from fear, but from a bone-deep exhaustion. I did what I had done for our entire 8-year marriage. I opened my laptop, logged into my private bank account, and transferred $8,000 to clear his debt. I watched the green confirmation screen load, feeling a familiar heavy tightness in my chest. It was not the money that hurt me. It was the absolute drain of constantly being the invisible safety net for a man who refused to look down and see who was catching him. 10 minutes later, the front door swung open. Thomas walked in, shaking the rain off his expensive leather jacket. That was another item he had purchased on a credit card I secretly paid off last year. He walked right past me. He did not look at the yellow paper sitting on the table. He did not ask how my day was. He walked straight to the stove and lifted the lid off the Dutch oven. "Chicken again," he sighed, letting the heavy lid clang back down against the metal pot. "I work a 12-hour day trying to build a real estate empire. Clara and I come home to dry chicken. You have been home all day clicking buttons on your computer. The least you could do is make a decent meal for the man who puts a roof over your head." I closed my laptop quietly. I did not mention the $8,000. I did not tell him that his truck was safe, that his credit score was preserved, or that I had just cleaned up another one of his expensive financial disasters. I just swallowed the massive lump in my throat and apologized for the dinner, he scoffed, grabbing a cold beer from the fridge. "I really do not know why you stress yourself out over that little freelance bookkeeping gig of yours," he said, taking a long drink and leaning against the kitchen counter. "What do you even pull in maybe 40 grand on a good year? You should just quit and focus on keeping this house clean. My new property flipping project is going to take off any day now. Then you will not have to worry your pretty little head about numbers." I looked at my husband, this man whose ego was so fragile it required constant daily feeding, and I just nodded. I let him believe he was the ultimate provider. I let him believe my job was just a cute little hobby to pass the time. What Thomas did not know, what nobody in his entire extended family knew, was that I was not a low-level bookkeeper struggling to find local clients. In reality, I operated a highly lucrative fractional chief financial officer consultancy for Silicon Valley tech startups. I worked in my yoga pants, from our spare bedroom structuring multi-million-dollar funding rounds, auditing massive corporate accounts, and managing corporate acquisitions. My income was carefully shielded under a discreet limited liability company I had formed before we even got married. Thomas truly believed I made $40,000 a year. The truth was, I was quietly banking $740,000 annually. I hid my massive success because early in our relationship, I realized that Thomas deeply resented any woman who outshined him. Whenever I achieved a milestone in my 20s, he would grow sullen, distant, and critical. I thought that by shrinking myself, I was being a good, supportive wife. I thought love meant making sure your partner felt big and strong, even if it meant making yourself small and invisible. I convinced myself that paying his debts in secret was an act of profound marital devotion. For 8 years, I quietly paid off his maxed-out credit cards, his failed business loans, and his unpaid taxes. I believed I was protecting his pride so he could finally succeed and be the man he wanted to be. But standing there in the kitchen, watching him chew the dinner I bought with the money I earned while complaining about the life I was secretly financing, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a terrifying truth. I was not protecting a partner. I was enabling a parasite. And my silent sacrifices were not buying his love or his respect. They were just buying his complete contempt. I did not say anything to him that night. I just cleaned up the kitchen while he went to watch television. But as the soap suds washed down the drain, I promised myself that the $8,000 I paid today would be the absolute last time I ever saved him. The sun came up the next morning, painting the kitchen walls in pale shades of gold. I was already at the counter pouring my second cup of coffee. I had been awake since 3 in the morning. My mind was spinning with numbers and deadlines for my corporate clients, but mostly it was spinning with the heavy weight of my marriage. Thomas walked into the kitchen wearing a crisp white dress shirt. He smelled of expensive cologne. He dropped a thick manila folder onto the granite island. The loud slap of the paper echoed in the quiet room. I set my coffee mug down slowly. I asked him what the paperwork was for. My voice was careful. I kept my face perfectly neutral. He told me he finalized the paperwork the day before. He did not look at me. He was busy adjusting his expensive silk tie. He said it was for the new property on Elm Street. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. He announced that he took out a $40,000 business loan to cover the initial renovations. He looked at me with wild excitement in his eyes. He said this flip was going to make us rich. He claimed the market was hot, and he knew exactly what he was doing. I stared at him. $40,000. It was another loan. Another massive financial hole he was digging while expecting me to stand at the edge and throw a rope down to him. This was his 4th real estate flipping venture in 3 years. The first 3 had been complete disasters. He would buy a dilapidated property with borrowed money, hire cheap contractors who did terrible work, run out of funds, and then sell the property at a massive loss. I repeated the number out loud. 40,000. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. He snapped at me instantly. His charming demeanor vanished. He told me not to give him that look. He said I had no idea how the real estate market worked. He lectured me that it takes money to make money. He crossed his arms and told me we were going to have to tighten the belt for the next few months. He demanded that I cut back on the grocery budget. He told me to stop buying expensive organic vegetables and to cancel the gym membership I rarely had time to use. He looked me right in the eyes and said, "We all have to make sacrifices for the family business." I looked at the man I had married. He was standing in a house he did not buy, drinking coffee he did not pay for, lecturing me about making sacrifices. I wanted to scream. I wanted to open my laptop and show him my corporate bank accounts. I wanted to print out my tax returns and staple them to his forehead. But I did not. I just nodded and told him I would look over the household budget. He smiled, patted my shoulder like I was an obedient child, and walked out the door to go play businessman. When the front door closed, the silence in the house became deafening. I sank into one of the kitchen chairs and wrapped my hands around my warm mug. I closed my eyes and let the memories of the last 8 years wash over me. It had not always been this bad. Or maybe it had, and I was just too blinded by love to see the truth. When we got married, I genuinely believed that a partnership meant protecting your spouse from the harsh realities of the world. I thought love meant standing between your partner and their mistakes. Thomas had always possessed a grand vision for his life. He wanted to be a tycoon. He wanted to be a self-made millionaire. The problem was that he possessed absolutely zero work ethic and zero financial literacy. Within our first year of marriage, I found a stack of hidden credit card bills stuffed in the back of his closet. He had maxed out 3 different cards to fund a failed technology startup with his friends. He had bought expensive office furniture, paid for lavish team lunches, and blown through $70,000 without creating a single usable product. When I confronted him, he broke down crying. He told me he was just trying to provide for our future. He said he was a failure. I could not bear to see him cry. I loved him. I held him and promised we would figure it out. What I actually meant was that I would figure it out. That was the moment I crossed the line from a supportive wife to a silent savior. I used my income from my financial consultancy to pay off those credit cards. I did it quietly. I never threw it in his face. I thought I was protecting his pride. But that was just the beginning. 2 years later came the IRS back taxes. He had failed to report income from a short-lived consulting gig and ignored the warning letters for months. He owed $45,000 in taxes and penalties. The government was threatening to put a lien on our house, the house that I had purchased entirely with my own money before we even met. I paid the IRS in full within 48 hours. Thomas promised he would pay me back. He promised he would change. He never paid back a single dime. Over the course of 8 years, I secretly paid off over $300,000 of his accumulated debts. I cleared his name when a business partner sued him for breach of contract. I paid off the lease on the luxury vehicles he bought to look successful. I fixed his credit score so he could continue to qualify for loans. I became the invisible architect of his entire life. To fund his mistakes, I sacrificed everything that brought me joy. I stopped taking vacations. When my friends planned a girls' trip to Italy, I lied and told them I was too busy with my bookkeeping clients. The truth was that I had just used my vacation fund to cover an emergency legal settlement for Thomas. I drove a 10-year-old sedan while he drove a customized truck. I wore inexpensive clothes while he wore tailored suits. I spent my evenings analyzing corporate spreadsheets to earn extra bonuses, just so I could maintain the illusion that our household was surviving on his income. I believed with my whole heart that marriage required this level of devotion. I thought I was building a solid foundation for our future. I told myself that one day he would succeed, and he would finally recognize the sacrifices I had made for him. But staring at that empty kitchen, the bitter reality finally settled into my bones. My sacrifices had not built a foundation. They had built a comfortable cage where he could play make-believe while I did all the heavy lifting. My thoughts were interrupted by the buzzing of my phone. It was a calendar reminder. Sunday dinner. My stomach tied itself into a familiar knot. Every Sunday at 5 in the evening, my mother-in-law Barbara and my sister-in-law Jessica came over for dinner. This was a long-standing tradition that Thomas insisted upon. He said it was important for the family to stay connected. What it really meant was that I had to spend my Sunday cooking an elaborate meal for 2 women who treated me like the hired help. Barbara and Jessica arrived exactly at 5. I watched them pull into the driveway from the kitchen window. Barbara drove a pristine white Mercedes. Jessica drove a brand new luxury SUV. They stepped out of their vehicles wearing designer clothes and carrying expensive handbags. They looked like they had just stepped out of a wealthy lifestyle magazine. I opened the front door. Barbara swept past me without making eye contact. She handed me her expensive wool coat. She greeted me in a tone that suggested she was speaking to a slightly dim-witted child. She told me she hoped I did not overcook the roast this time, because her stomach was very sensitive to dry meat. I replied politely and hung her coat in the closet. I assured her the roast was perfect and that I had been slow cooking it all afternoon. Jessica walked in behind her mother. She was busy typing on her phone. She barely looked up to acknowledge my presence. She muttered a quick hello and asked if Thomas was in the living room. I told her he was watching the game. They both hurried into the living room to greet him. I could hear their voices shift instantly. They sounded warm and excited. Barbara kissed his cheek and told him how handsome he looked. Jessica asked him about his new business venture. I stood in the hallway for a moment. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I reminded myself to stay calm. I walked back into the kitchen to finish preparing the dinner. The meal I had prepared cost over $100. I had bought a premium cut of beef, fresh organic vegetables, and a bottle of expensive red wine. I had paid for every single item with my own money. Thomas had not contributed a penny to the grocery budget in 6 months, but when we sat down at the dining room table, Thomas proudly carved the meat and poured the wine, as if he had hunted and gathered the entire feast himself. Barbara took a sip of her wine and smiled at her son. She told him the food was wonderful. She praised him for always providing so well for his family. She said it was a blessing to see a man take such good care of his household. Thomas smiled confidently and thanked his mother. He puffed out his chest and stated his belief that a man should be the pillar of his home. He called it a heavy responsibility, but claimed he was happy to carry it. I stared at my plate. I chewed a piece of roasted carrot slowly. I tried to focus on the taste of the food instead of the burning anger rising in my chest. Jessica reached across the table for the salt. She looked at me with a pitying expression. She asked me if I was still doing my little typing job. She pretended she could not remember what it was called and asked if it was freelance accounting. I corrected her quietly and said it was bookkeeping. I confirmed that I was still doing it. Barbara let out a soft, elegant laugh. She said it was cute that I had a hobby to keep myself busy while Thomas built his empire. She then shifted her tone and told me I really should focus more on supporting him. She pointed out that she had noticed dust on the baseboards in the hallway. She boldly stated that when a man works as hard as Thomas does, he deserves to come home to an immaculate house. I kept my voice perfectly flat and told Barbara I would keep that in mind. Thomas chimed in and agreed with his mother. He pointed his silver fork directly at me. He told his family that I needed to step up my game around the house. He proudly announced his new real estate project and bragged about the massive loan he took out to fund the renovations. He looked at me and said we were going to be making some serious lifestyle adjustments and that I was going to have to learn how to stretch a dollar. Barbara nodded sympathetically. She looked at me and said it was the burden of being married to a visionary. She praised Thomas for always possessing a brilliant mind for business. She told me I was lucky to have a man who thinks so big. She said most women would kill for a husband with such ambition and advised me to just tighten my belt and follow his lead. Jessica enthusiastically agreed with her mother. She took a large bite of the roast I had paid for. She looked right at me and said, I just needed to be a good, supportive wife. She told me to stop worrying about my little numbers and let Thomas handle the real money. I looked around the dining room table. I looked at the beautiful crystal glasses, the expensive china, the abundant food. I looked at the three of them sitting there full of arrogance and entitlement. They truly believed their own narrative. They believed Thomas was a genius. They believed I was a simple, unimportant little woman who was lucky to be allowed in their presence. I swallowed the bite of food in my mouth. It tasted like sawdust. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to grab the folder Thomas had brought home that morning. I wanted to reveal the truth about his ruined credit. I wanted to tell Barbara that her son was a complete financial disaster, who was only surviving because I quietly bailed him out month after month. I wanted to tell Jessica that my little numbers generated over $700,000 a year. But I looked at Thomas. He was glowing under the praise of his mother and sister. He looked so incredibly proud of himself. He looked at me with a smug, condescending smile. I realized in that exact moment that telling them the truth right now would not change anything. They would just find a way to twist it. They would accuse me of trying to emasculate him. They would claim I was lying. The delusion in this family ran too deep to be shattered by a simple conversation over dinner. If I was going to expose the truth, it had to be undeniable. It had to be a complete and total destruction of the lies they had built their lives upon. I smiled warmly at Barbara. I looked directly into her eyes. I told her softly that she was absolutely right. I promised her that I was going to start paying very close attention to how Thomas handles the real money. I told her I was going to tighten my belt and watch his business extremely closely from now on. Barbara smiled back at me. She was completely oblivious to the cold promise hidden inside my words. She called me a good girl and said that was exactly what a devoted wife should do. I picked up my wine glass and took a slow, measured sip. The wine was rich and complex. I savored the flavor. I sat there in silence for the rest of the dinner. I listened to them brag and boast. I cleared the dishes when they were finished. I washed the plates while they sat in the living room drinking coffee. I played the role of the quiet, obedient wife to perfection. The warm water cascaded over my hands as I scrubbed the expensive porcelain plates. The house was filled with the sound of Thomas boasting about his imaginary future wealth. His voice echoed down the hallway, loud and full of unearned confidence. He was telling Jessica about the imported Italian marble he planned to install in his new flip. He was describing the luxury vacations he intended to take his mother on once the profits started rolling in. Every word he spoke was funded by my silent labor, my stolen peace, my deferred dreams. I rinsed the final plate and set it in the drying rack. I dried my hands on a cotton towel. I stared out the kitchen window into the dark backyard. The illusion of my partnership was completely shattered. For 8 years, I had poured my energy, my love, and my massive income into a bottomless pit of male ego. I had thought I was watering a garden that would eventually bloom and provide shade for both of us. Instead, I had been watering a patch of concrete, hoping against all logic that something beautiful would grow. I turned off the kitchen faucet. The sudden silence in the room was a stark contrast to the loud voices in the living room. I folded the towel neatly and draped it over the oven handle. I did not feel sad anymore. The heavy, suffocating sadness that had weighed on my chest for years had completely evaporated. It was replaced by something sharp, cold, and incredibly clear. I walked quietly toward the hallway. I paused just out of their sight line, listening to them laugh together. They were a family of parasites feeding on my resources while complaining about the taste. But they had made one massive, fatal miscalculation. They forgot that the person who controls the numbers controls the entire game, and I was tired of playing the victim in a game I was entirely capable of winning. Monday mornings usually offered a brief window of peace. I woke up at 5 in the morning before the sun even considered rising over our Ohio suburb. The house was wrapped in absolute silence. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Thomas, and walked down the hall to my home office. I was wearing my old gray sweatpants and a faded college shirt. To the rest of the world, and especially to my husband, this was just my little bookkeeping uniform. But the moment I sat down at my dual monitors and entered my encrypted passwords, I became the chief financial officer for 3 different emerging technology companies. I spent the first 2 hours of my morning negotiating vendor contracts and reviewing quarterly tax strategies. I was in my element. I felt powerful. I felt respected. Then I made the mistake of logging into our personal joint checking account. I only accessed that account to pay our household utility bills and the property taxes. I always made sure there was a comfortable cushion of cash in there. I would secretly transfer portions of my actual income into the joint account, letting Thomas believe his sporadic real estate commissions were covering our lifestyle. I clicked on the account summary tab, expecting to see the $20,000 I had secured there last week. The balance was $5,000. I stopped breathing. The air simply vanished from my lungs. I leaned closer to the monitor. The bright white light of the screen burned my eyes. I clicked on the recent transactions history. Right there at the top of the ledger was a cleared wire transfer. $15,000 had been withdrawn the previous afternoon, while I was busy roasting a premium cut of beef for his mother and sister. The destination account was a commercial holding company I did not recognize. My hands gripped the edge of my desk. $15,000. For a woman earning over $700,000 a year, $15,000 might not seem like a life-altering amount of money. But that was not the point at all. The point was the violation. The point was the absolute audacity of his entitlement. That money was our safety net for the house. It was the mortgage buffer. And he had taken it without a single word of discussion. I sat in the glow of my monitors for a full hour. I did not cry. The time for crying had ended during that miserable Sunday dinner. Instead, my mind shifted into a cold and clinical mode. I stopped thinking like a betrayed wife and started thinking like a forensic auditor. I traced the wire confirmation number. I pulled the routing details. I documented everything. I took screenshots and saved them to a secure encrypted folder on my private server. Every time I pressed a key, my resolve hardened. I realized he had not just made a careless mistake. He had executed a planned financial maneuver to bypass my consent. At 7 in the morning, I heard the heavy footsteps of my husband coming down the stairs. I closed my corporate financial windows. I pulled up a generic spreadsheet to maintain my cover. Thomas walked into my office a few minutes later, holding a mug of black coffee. He was wearing his expensive silk robe, looking like a man who did not have a single care in the world. He smelled of rich coffee and unearned confidence. He leaned against the doorframe and took a slow sip of his coffee. He looked at me with that familiar, condescending smirk. He told me I was up early playing with my little spreadsheets again. He said it was cute how dedicated I was to my freelance hobby, but suggested I should probably focus more on making him a hot breakfast. I turned my chair around to face him. I kept my voice perfectly flat. I asked him where the $15,000 went. The smirk melted off his face instantly. He stood up straight. His eyes darted toward my computer screen and then back to me. He did not ask how I knew. He did not apologize. He immediately went on the offensive, throwing his shoulders back to make himself look physically larger in the small doorway. It was a classic intimidation tactic, one he had used successfully for 8 years. He let out a loud and theatrical sigh and walked into the room. He told me I had no right to snoop through the finances without consulting him first. He said he was the head of the household, and he made the complex financial decisions. I reminded him calmly that it was a joint account. I reminded him that my name was on the ledger and that my hard-earned money funded that account. He laughed. It was a harsh and barking sound that contained absolutely zero humor. He pointed a finger at me and told me I did not understand high-level business. He claimed the $15,000 was a vital capital injection for his latest property flip. He used those exact words, vital capital injection. He strung together corporate buzzwords he had probably heard on some motivational podcast. He talked about leveraging liquid assets, maximizing return on investment, and securing primary market positioning. He spoke with the unearned authority of a man who believed his gender automatically made him an economic genius. I stared at him. I literally manage millions of dollars in venture capital funding. Just last month, I had successfully negotiated a $40 million merger for a client in Silicon Valley. I know what liquidity looks like. I know what market positioning means. Listening to him misuse basic economic terms to justify stealing from his own wife was like listening to a toddler explain quantum physics. But I could not tell him that. I had to play the role he believed I occupied. I had to remain the simple bookkeeper. I kept my tone steady. I told him a vital capital injection does not explain draining our emergency fund without a conversation. I told him a partnership requires mutual respect and communication. Thomas slammed his coffee mug down on my desk. Dark liquid sloshed over the rim and stained a stack of printed invoices. He leaned over me, his face turning a dark shade of red. He told me I was financially illiterate. He looked right into my eyes and called me a small-minded clerk who could not see the bigger picture. He said he was out there in the real world taking massive risks to build an empire for us, while I sat in my pajamas counting pennies. He accused me of trying to sabotage his success because I was naturally jealous of his ambition and drive. The gaslighting was so intense it actually made me physically dizzy. He had taken my money, jeopardized our household security, and now he was aggressively positioning himself as the victim of my lack of support. He told me that successful men require supportive wives, not auditors, who question every bold move they make. He brought his family into the argument. He said his mother was right about me. He said Barbara had warned him that I lacked the vision required to be a wealthy man's wife. He proudly proclaimed that his sister Jessica would never question her husband this way. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my intelligence. I just asked him how he planned to pay the property taxes that were due at the end of the month, now that the account was completely drained. He waved his hand dismissively, as if property taxes were a trivial nuisance for commoners. He told me not to worry about it. He said the property flip would yield a massive payout in less than 60 days. He promised we would be swimming in cash by the end of the summer. And then his expression shifted from anger to a cold and calculating determination. He reached into the deep pocket of his silk robe and pulled out a thick stack of folded documents. I tossed them onto my desk right next to the spilled coffee. I told me I needed to sign those immediately. I looked down at the documents. The bold letters at the top of the first page read Home Equity Line of Credit Agreement. It was a formal loan application. He was trying to borrow money against the equity of our home. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I bought this house 3 years before I ever met Thomas. I saved my corporate bonuses, I lived frugally, and I put down a massive down payment entirely on my own. The deed was exclusively in my name. The mortgage was exclusively in my name. When we got married, he moved in with 2 suitcases and a mountain of credit card debt. He never contributed a single dime to the mortgage principal. He never paid for a roof repair or a plumbing emergency. Yet he walked around the house acting like he was the lord of the manor. And now he wanted to leverage my hard-earned equity to fund his delusional real estate fantasies. I picked up the paperwork. The application requested a credit line of $150,000. He had already filled out all his personal information. He had listed himself as the primary borrower. He had completely fabricated his annual income on the form. He just needed my signature as the legal property owner to authorize the lien against the house. I set the papers back down on the desk. I looked up at him and said no. Thomas froze. He looked at me as if I had just spoken to him in a language he did not comprehend. He asked me to repeat myself. His voice was dangerously low. I told him I was not signing a home equity loan. I told him the house was my only secure asset, and I was not going to risk losing my home for a property flip that I had no legal part in. His reaction was immediate and terrifying. He did not just get angry, he erupted. He kicked the side of my wooden desk so hard the monitors physically shook. He began pacing back and forth across the small home office, running his hands through his hair, muttering curses under his breath. He turned to face me, his eyes wide and furious. He demanded to know who I thought I was. He told me I was his wife, and I was legally obligated to support his business ventures. He completely ignored the fact that he brought absolutely no financial value to the marriage. He twisted the narrative with such practiced skill, it was almost hypnotic. He yelled that he was killing himself trying to provide a luxury lifestyle for me. He screamed that I was ungrateful and blind. He said I was a terrible wife who was actively trying to destroy his career, just when he was on the verge of a massive breakthrough. I sat perfectly still. I watched his face contort with rage. I watched him perform this incredible routine of toxic masculinity and aggressive entitlement. A year ago, this behavior would have reduced me to tears. I would have felt guilty. I would have internalized his anger and believed that I was indeed a bad partner holding him back. I would have picked up a pen and signed the documents just to restore the peace in our household and prove my love to him. But not today. The $15,000 theft had severed the final thread of my emotional dependency. I saw him clearly now. I saw a fragile and insecure boy wrapped in a man's body, terrified of his own incompetence, desperately trying to steal my resources to build a fake throne. Thomas stopped pacing. He stepped close to my chair and planted both hands firmly on my desk, trapping me in place. He lowered his voice to a menacing whisper. He told me that if I did not sign those papers, he would pack his bags and walk out the door. He said he would leave me all alone in this big empty house. He told me I would have absolutely nothing without his earning potential. He said his new business partners were expecting this funding by Friday, and if I embarrassed him by blocking the capital, he would never forgive me. He gave me an ultimatum. He said I had 24 hours to think about it. He told me I could either be the supportive wife who stands beside a future millionaire, or I could be the miserable and stubborn obstacle he leaves behind in the dirt. He told me to choose very carefully because my entire future depended on what I did next. He snatched his coffee mug off the desk, turned around, and marched out of the office. He walked down the hall and slammed the bedroom door so hard the framed pictures on the walls rattled. I sat alone in the quiet office. I looked at the coffee stains on my invoices. I looked at the loan applications sitting on my keyboard. He truly believed he had backed me into a corner. He believed I was a small and frightened woman who made $40,000 a year and desperately needed a man to validate her existence. He believed his threat of leaving me was the ultimate weapon that would force my compliance. He did not realize he had just given me a massive gift. He had shown me his exact playbook. He had shown me that he was willing to bankrupt me to save himself. He had drawn a line in the sand. And as I carefully folded the loan documents and placed them in my desk drawer, I made my choice. I was not going to sign his papers. I was not going to cry for a man who viewed me as a personal bank. I was going to use his arrogance against him, and I was going to dismantle his entire life piece by piece. The rest of the day stretched out in a tense and heavy silence. I remained in my office. I stared at the closed door. I could hear Thomas downstairs. He was pacing the hardwood floors. He was making loud phone calls to his supposed business partners. He was projecting his voice so I would hear him bragging about the massive renovations he was planning for the Elm Street property. He talked about imported Italian tiles, custom cabinetry, and high-end appliances. He talked about the massive profit margins they were going to secure by the end of the summer. Every word was a deliberate performance designed to make me feel small. It was a calculated display designed to make me feel like an ignorant obstacle standing in the way of his inevitable success. Hours passed. The afternoon sun faded into a dull and gray evening. Rain began to tap against the glass of my office window. I did not go downstairs to make dinner. For the first time in 8 years, I did not care if he was hungry. I did not care if his laundry was folded. I sat at my desk and looked at the home equity line of credit application. $150,000. He wanted to gamble away the only secure asset I possessed. I wanted to leverage the roof over my head to fund a fantasy. At 7:00, the heavy footsteps started up the stairs. The sound sent a familiar spike of anxiety through my chest, a conditioned response to his anger. The door to my office swung open. Thomas walked in. He had changed out of his silk robe and was now wearing a sharp button-down shirt and tailored slacks. He looked like a man ready to close a major deal. He walked straight to my desk. He did not ask how my day was. He did not apologize for his outburst that morning. He simply tapped his index finger on the folded loan application sitting near my keyboard. He told me the 24 hours were up. He said his partners needed a verbal confirmation tonight so they could move forward with the contractors in the morning. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy silver pen. He laid it gently on top of the documents. He told me to sign the papers so we could put this silly little argument behind us. He promised that after I signed, we would go out and get a nice, expensive steak dinner to celebrate our future wealth. I looked at the silver pen. Then I looked up at his face. His expression was a mixture of supreme confidence and underlying irritation. He fully expected me to cave. He had spent 8 years training me to surrender. Whenever he got angry, I would apologize to keep the peace. Whenever he demanded money for a new venture, I would quietly pay it to support his dreams. He thought this was just another routine transaction in our marriage. He assumed my boundaries were entirely negotiable. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I kept my voice incredibly calm and steady. I told him my answer was still no. I told him I was not going to sign away the equity in my home for a high-risk real estate venture that I had absolutely no part in planning. The air in the room instantly evaporated. The confident, charming smile slid off his face like wet paint. It was replaced by a look of absolute disgust. He snatched the silver pen off the desk. He gripped it so hard his knuckles turned white. He leaned forward. He placed both of his hands flat on my desk, leaning his entire body weight toward me. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and imposing, and he knew exactly how to use his physical presence to intimidate women. He asked me if I was out of my mind. His voice was low and vibrating with a dangerous rage. He told me I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. He said I was letting my petty, irrational insecurities ruin the greatest financial opportunity of his entire life. He accused me of being financially blind. I did not shrink back in my chair. I did not look away. I looked directly into his dark eyes. I told him this financial opportunity was a delusion. I reminded him that his last 3 real estate projects had ended in catastrophic losses. I pointed out that he had completely drained our joint checking account of $15,000 without my permission, just to cover his initial expenses. I told him a real businessman does not steal from his own household emergency fund to cover his mistakes. That was the breaking point. The truth hit his fragile ego like a lit match hitting a pool of gasoline. He erupted. He slammed his fist down on my desk so hard that my ceramic coffee mug rattled and tipped over. Cold, dark coffee spilled across the wood, soaking into a stack of printed invoices. I did not even flinch. I just watched the dark liquid spread toward my keyboard. He towered over me. His face turned a dark, furious shade of crimson. The veins in his neck were pulsing visibly against his collar. He began to scream. He screamed that I was a bitter, unsupportive, and miserable wife. He yelled that I was deeply jealous of his vision because I was nothing but a low-level clerk. He pointed a finger directly at my face, jabbing the air inches from my nose. He told me I was a small-minded woman who was terrified of real success. He shouted that his mother was completely right about me. He claimed Barbara had always known I would be an anchor dragging him down into mediocrity. I sat perfectly still. I let him rage. I listened to the rain hitting the window pane behind me, a steady rhythm against the chaotic violence of his temper. I watched him perform this desperate and aggressive dance of toxic masculinity. He was a man drowning in his own incompetence, thrashing wildly and trying to pull me under with him. Then he stopped yelling. The sudden silence in the room was heavier than the shouting. He lowered his voice to a cruel and venomous whisper. He leaned in so close I could smell the sharp tang of his expensive cologne mixed with stale coffee. He looked me right in the eyes and delivered the words that would ultimately seal his own complete destruction. He sneered at me. He said I was absolutely nothing without him. He called me a glorified calculator. He told me I was a boring, invisible, and uninspiring little woman who sat in a spare bedroom all day clicking buttons for pennies. He said I should be down on my knees thanking God every single day that a man of his caliber was willing to stay married to me. Then he smiled. It was a cold reptilian smile devoid of any human warmth. He told me that if I did not sign those papers right now, he would pack his bags and walk out the front door. He said he would leave me all alone. He looked around my small home office, his eyes sweeping over my monitors and my filing cabinets with utter contempt. He laughed. It was a harsh barking sound. He told me that without his earning potential and his business acumen, I would lose this house within a year. He promised me that if he left, I would die broke in a miserable roach-infested one-bedroom apartment. He told me I would spend the rest of my life regretting the day I crossed him. He stood up straight. He adjusted his shirt collar and smoothed the front of his slacks. He looked incredibly proud of himself. He truly believed he had just delivered the ultimate killing blow. He believed he had struck my deepest, most agonizing fear. He thought I was terrified of being abandoned. He thought I was terrified of financial ruin and social humiliation. In the past, those words would have utterly destroyed me. A year ago, I would have burst into tears right there at my desk. I would have felt the familiar crush of guilt and panic. I would have begged him to stay. I would have internalized every single cruel and degrading thing he said. I would have believed that I was indeed a boring and invisible woman who was exceptionally lucky to have a handsome and ambitious husband. I would have picked up that heavy silver pen and signed my financial security away just to buy back his fake affection and restore the peace in our home. But as I sat there listening to this man tell me I would die, a profound and absolute shift occurred inside my mind. I did not feel the sudden stinging urge to cry. I did not feel a single drop of sadness or fear. The heavy and suffocating fog of marital obligation, the blind loyalty I had carried for 8 years, simply lifted. It was completely gone. It was replaced by a cold, crystal-clear realization that washed over me like freezing winter water. I saw him. I truly saw him for the very first time. I was not married to a partner who was struggling to find his way in the business world. I was not married to an unrecognized genius. I was married to a parasite. My love, my endless patience, and my silent, grueling sacrifices had never been a foundation for a shared future. They had merely been a shield. I had spent 8 years actively protecting a deeply entitled and deeply incompetent man from the natural consequences of his own disastrous actions. For 8 years, I had been paying off his massive, suffocating debts. I had saved his customized truck from repossession just yesterday. I had paid off the federal government when he ignored his taxes. I had cleared his maxed-out credit cards more times than I could count. I had quietly transferred hundreds of thousands of dollars of my own hard-earned money to keep his fake empire afloat and his fragile pride intact. And here he was, standing in the middle of the house that I bought with my own money, drinking the coffee I paid for, wearing the clothes I financed, threatening to leave me broke, threatening me with abject poverty when I was secretly earning $740,000 a year, managing millions in corporate assets. The irony was so incredibly sharp it almost made me smile. But I did not smile. I realized in that exact moment that arguing with a parasite is a complete waste of energy. You do not negotiate with a parasite. You do not try to make a parasite understand your feelings. You surgically remove it from your life. I stopped defending myself. I stopped pointing out his past failures. I let my shoulders drop forward. I looked down at the spilled coffee soaking into my documents. I forced my facial expression to look defeated, exhausted, and small. I gave him exactly what his ego desperately needed to see. I played the role of the terrified, submissive, and broken wife to absolute perfection. I took a slow and shaky breath, manufacturing a slight tremble in my voice. I told him I did not want him to leave me. I kept my voice soft and hesitant, looking up at him through my eyelashes. I told him he had said some very hurtful things, and I just needed a little bit of time to process everything because I was so overwhelmed. I looked at him with wide and fearful eyes. I picked up the damp home equity loan application and folded it carefully, wiping a drop of coffee from the edge. I told him I would think about the paperwork. I promised him I would seriously review the budget numbers tonight and give him a final positive answer in the morning. I told him I just needed to sleep on it. Thomas relaxed instantly. The rigid tension left his broad shoulders. The cruel, victorious smirk returned to his face. He believed he had won the war. He believed his aggressive intimidation tactics had successfully broken my rebellious spirit. He walked around the desk and patted the top of my head exactly like I was an obedient, simple-minded dog. He told me that was a much better attitude. He said he knew I would eventually come to my senses and see the bigger picture like a good wife should. He told me to take the night to run my little calculations and play with my spreadsheets. He said he was going to go out and meet his business partners at the country club for a few drinks to smooth things over and assure them the capital was secured. He told me not to wait up for him. He turned around and walked out of my office. He strutted down the hallway with the unearned, swaggering confidence of a man who thought he controlled the entire world. I sat perfectly still and listened to his footsteps descending the wooden stairs. I listened to the front door open and click shut. I heard the loud, aggressive engine of his customized truck roar to life in the driveway. I sat in the dim silence of my office and listened as the sound of his vehicle faded away into the rainy night. I was completely alone in the house. I picked up the heavy silver pen he had left on my desk. I rolled it slowly between my fingers. The metal was cold and solid. I looked at the folded loan application. I did not throw it in the trash can. I opened my bottom desk drawer and placed the fraudulent documents carefully inside. They were no longer a threat to my security. They were evidence for my attorney. I reached for a roll of paper towels and calmly wiped the spilled coffee off my desk. I dried the polished wood meticulously. I organized my stained invoices into a neat pile. I reached forward and brought my dual monitors back to life. The screens illuminated the dark room with a bright, crisp light. I typed in my complex encrypted passwords and opened my private corporate accounts. I looked at the glowing numbers on the screen. The massive cash balances. The successful diversified investment portfolios. The tangible, undeniable proof of my actual worth in the real world. He thought I was a glorified calculator. I was absolutely right about one thing. I was about to calculate the exact devastating cost of his betrayal, and I was going to make sure he paid every single cent of it. I opened a new, highly secure digital folder on my private server. I named it Project Eviction. I began to transfer the screenshots of his $15,000 unauthorized withdrawal. I began to compile the historical data of every single debt, loan, and credit card I had ever paid on his behalf over the last 8 years. I started pulling the county property tax records, the deed to the house, and the original mortgage documents that unequivocally proved he had absolutely no legal claim to my property. My hands were no longer shaking. My heart was beating with a slow, steady, and relentless rhythm. The sad, accommodating woman who had cried over his insults was dead. The invisible wife, who had shrunk herself to fit into his fragile ego, was gone forever. I sat in my home office surrounded by the glow of my monitors and fully embraced the cold, calculating, and ruthless financial professional that I truly was. I was entirely ready to stop being his supportive wife. I was ready to become his absolute worst nightmare. The morning sun crept through the blinds of my home office, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. It was a Saturday. Normally on a Saturday morning, I would be downstairs in the kitchen making a large breakfast for Thomas. I would be brewing his favorite premium coffee and frying bacon exactly the way he liked it. I would be playing the role of the devoted and simple wife. But that woman did not exist anymore. She had evaporated the moment he told me I would die broke in a one-bedroom apartment. The woman sitting at the desk this morning was the chief financial officer of 3 highly successful technology firms. And I was about to conduct the most important financial audit of my entire life. I unlocked my primary computer terminal. The cooling fans hummed to life, breaking the absolute silence of the empty house. Thomas had not come home last night. After his explosive tantrum, he had driven off in his customized truck to meet his imaginary business partners. He was probably sleeping off a hangover on his mother's velvet couch right now. I did not care where he was. His physical absence gave me the unbroken silence I needed to work. I logged into my secure servers and bypassed the generic spreadsheet I usually kept open for his benefit. I loaded my professional financial analysis software. This was the same software I used to track multi-million-dollar venture capital funds. Today I was going to use it to dissect my husband. I started with the basics. I pulled the full transaction history of our joint checking account going back 5 full years. I did not just look at the summaries. I downloaded the raw data files. I needed every single routing number, every wire transfer code, and every merchant identification tag. I exported the data into a massive digital ledger. The screen filled with thousands of lines of numbers. To a normal person, it would look like a chaotic wall of text. To me, it was a clear and perfectly readable map. Money never simply disappears. It leaves a digital footprint. It leaves a trail of breadcrumbs that tells a very specific story if you know how to read the language of banking. I focused on the immediate bleeding first. The $15,000 he had withdrawn on Thursday afternoon. He had told me it was a vital capital injection for his Elm Street property flip. I traced the wire transfer confirmation number through the Federal Reserve routing system. The money had not gone to a title company. It had not gone to a general contractor or a building supply warehouse. The funds had been deposited into a limited liability corporation registered in Delaware. The company name was Zenith Holdings. I opened a new search window and accessed the public corporate registry databases. I cross-referenced the filing documents for Zenith Holdings. The registered agent was a cheap legal service company, but the managing member was listed as Thomas Harding. He had created a shell company. I was using it to filter money out of our joint account to make it look like a legitimate business expense. I leaned closer to my monitors. The bright light reflected in my eyes. I was not shocked. I was deeply focused. I initiated a deep background search on Zenith Holdings using my corporate access credentials. I pulled the credit report associated with the shell company's tax identification number. The results populated on my screen within 30 seconds. Zenith Holdings did not own any real estate on Elm Street. In fact, Zenith Holdings did not own any physical property at all. It was simply a checking account designed to receive and redistribute stolen funds. I tracked the outbound transfers from that specific account. The $15,000 had been chopped into smaller pieces within 24 hours of the initial deposit. $3,000 had been wired to a high-end jewelry boutique downtown. I pulled the merchant code and cross-referenced it with the store's online catalog. He had purchased a diamond tennis bracelet. I looked down at my own bare wrists. I wore a simple silver watch I had bought for myself 5 years ago. He had certainly not bought that diamond bracelet for me. Another $5,000 had been transferred to a luxury property management group. I dug into the transaction details. It was a lease payment. The property address was located in the most expensive high-rise residential tower in the city. The rent was exactly $5,000 a month. Thomas was not flipping houses. He was funding a secret lifestyle in a luxury apartment downtown while demanding that I cut back on our household grocery budget. I felt a cold and steady rhythm settling into my chest. Every new piece of evidence tightened my focus. I was peeling back the layers of a massive and deliberate financial deception. I shifted my attention to the $40,000 business loan he had bragged about securing. He had claimed the loan was necessary for renovations. I tracked the origination of that loan using the fraudulent paperwork he had left in my office the day before. The funds had been dispersed into another account controlled by Zenith Holdings. From there, the money flowed out like water from a broken pipe. I traced every single drop. The ledger revealed a shocking pattern of weekly wire transfers. Every Monday morning, exactly $1,500 was automatically routed to a personal checking account. I pulled the account ownership records. The name on the account was Barbara Harding, his mother. I stared at the screen. The letters of her name seemed to burn into my monitors. $1,500 a week, $6,000 a month. He was secretly paying his mother a massive allowance out of the money he was stealing from me. I thought about Barbara sitting at my dining room table just a few days ago. I remembered her elegant white coat and her expensive designer handbag. I remembered the way she had looked down her nose at my modest clothing. I remembered her telling me that I needed to be a better wife and support her brilliant son. She had been drinking the expensive wine I bought and giving me condescending advice while secretly living off the very money her son was draining from my emergency fund. The absolute hypocrisy of it was staggering. She knew. She had to know. She knew her son was a failure who produced no actual income. She knew the money funding her luxurious country club lifestyle was coming directly from the daughter-in-law she openly despised. But Barbara was not the only beneficiary of this elaborate theft. I scrolled further down the transaction list. Every Friday afternoon, another automatic transfer of $800 was sent to a different account. I ran the routing numbers. The recipient was Jessica Harding, my sister-in-law. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with devastating clarity. Jessica drove a brand-new luxury vehicle. She wore designer clothes. She took frequent weekend trips to expensive spa resorts. During every family dinner, she would mock my little bookkeeping job and tell me to let Thomas handle the real money. She acted like a wealthy heiress. In reality, she was just another parasite feeding at the trough her brother had built using my stolen resources. Thomas was not just hiding debts. He was actively running a financial syndicate to fund his entire family's delusions of grandeur. He was playing the role of the wealthy and successful patriarch. He was buying his mother's praise and his sister's admiration. And he was using my money to finance the entire performance. I spent the next 6 hours meticulously documenting every single fraudulent transfer. I did not take a break to eat. I did not drink any water. I was fueled entirely by a pure and absolute demand for justice. I created a comprehensive digital dossier. I categorized the stolen funds into specific folders: the jewelry, the luxury apartment, the weekly allowances to Barbara and Jessica, the fake business expenses. I found receipts for expensive dinners at 5-star restaurants on Tuesday nights when he claimed he was working late at a construction site. I found payments to luxury car rental agencies. I even found a recurring monthly charge for a premium golf club membership in his mother's name. The total amount of money he had diverted through these shell accounts over the past 3 years was staggering. It went far beyond the $300,000 I had knowingly paid to clear his old debts. This was a separate, active, and malicious campaign of financial abuse. He had constructed a secret world where he was the king, his mother was the queen, and I was just the blind peasant generating the tax revenue to keep their castle standing. I compiled the evidence into a master spreadsheet. I color-coded the transactions. I attached the digital wire transfer receipts, the IP addresses from his login sessions, and the forged signature documents he had used to secure the loans. The final report was over 200 pages long. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. It was airtight, undeniable, and completely devastating. I printed a physical copy of the entire report. The heavy laser printer in the corner of my office churned for 20 minutes, pushing out page after page of undeniable proof. The warm stack of paper smelled of fresh ink and ozone. I placed the documents into a thick black binder. I ran my hand over the smooth leather cover. This binder was no longer just a collection of numbers. It was a loaded weapon. I walked over to the window and looked out at the street. The rain from last night had cleared, leaving a bright and sunny afternoon. The neighborhood was quiet. A woman was walking her golden retriever on the sidewalk. A neighbor across the street was washing his car. Everything looked so normal and peaceful on the outside. Nobody looking at this house would ever guess the absolute betrayal that lived inside its walls. I thought about the 24-year-old mistress I had not even officially tracked down yet. The diamond tennis bracelet and the luxury apartment lease told me everything I needed to know about her existence. Thomas was setting up a completely new life. He was preparing a soft landing for himself. His ultimate plan was blindingly obvious now. He intended to drain all the equity out of my house, force me to sign the fraudulent loan documents, secure his massive payout, and then serve me with divorce papers. He planned to leave me holding a mountain of debt while he moved into his downtown high-rise with his new girlfriend and continued to fund his mother's country club lifestyle. I truly believed he was the smartest person in the room. He believed I was a simple-minded calculator who would just cry and sign the papers to keep the peace. He had drastically underestimated his opponent. I walked back to my desk and picked up my phone. I scrolled through my contact list until I found the number I needed. It was not a marriage counselor. It was not a therapist. It was the personal cell phone number of an attorney I had worked with on corporate mergers. He was a legal shark who specialized in dismantling hostile corporate takeovers. And right now, I was facing the ultimate hostile takeover within my own marriage. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. I listened to it ring. I did not feel any hesitation. I did not feel any lingering affection for the man I had married. Thomas Harding had died in my mind the moment he told me I would die broke. The man currently walking around in his expensive suits was just a liability that needed to be liquidated. When the lawyer answered the phone, I told him I needed an emergency consultation on Monday morning. I told him I was dealing with a massive case of marital fraud, forged financial documents, and the unauthorized diversion of shared assets. I did not sound like a grieving wife. I sounded like a chief financial officer preparing for corporate warfare. When I hung up the phone, the house was still completely silent. I took a deep breath. The air in my office felt lighter. The suffocating weight of being a good and accommodating partner had vanished entirely. I picked up the thick black binder containing the audit report and locked it securely inside my fireproof safe. I spun the combination dial, locking the truth away until the exact moment it would cause the most destruction. I walked out of my office and went downstairs to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of cold water and drank it slowly. I looked at the empty counter where he had demanded a hot breakfast just 24 hours ago. He was probably planning his next grand entrance right now. I was probably practicing the speech he would use to intimidate me into signing his loan documents tonight. I smiled. It was a cold and authentic smile. He had no idea what was waiting for him. He thought he was playing a game of emotional manipulation against a weak and fearful woman. He did not know he had just stepped into a financial war zone against a professional who structured multi-million-dollar deals before lunch. I was going to let him keep playing his little game for a few more days. I was going to let him feel victorious and powerful. I was going to let him dig his own grave so deep that he would never be able to climb out. It took me exactly 3 hours to unravel the final piece of his secret life. I was still sitting in my home office surrounded by the printed pages of his financial betrayal when I noticed a recurring charge I had missed earlier. It was not a massive wire transfer like the others. It was a subtle recurring fee on a credit card statement I had found buried in a digital subfolder. $250 every single Friday afternoon for the past 4 months. The merchant name was listed as a generic hospitality management company. To an untrained eye, it looked like a standard business expense, perhaps a weekly catered lunch or a recurring equipment rental. But I do not have an untrained eye. I ran the merchant identification number through my corporate database. The generic holding company traced directly back to a property called the Oak Haven. The Oak Haven was not a standard chain hotel where weary travelers spent the night. It was an ultra-exclusive boutique resort located on the wealthy edge of the city. It was nestled behind tall iron gates and surrounded by private woods. It was the kind of place that prided itself on absolute discretion and quiet luxury. I looked at the digital timestamp of his most recent login to that specific credit card account. The IP address matched the public wireless network of that exact hotel. He had logged in less than an hour ago. He was not at the country club trying to smooth things over with imaginary business partners. He was there, right now. I did not hesitate. I did not stop to think about what I was doing. I simply grabbed my car keys and walked out the front door. The rain from the previous night had completely stopped, leaving the afternoon air thick and heavy with humidity. I got into my 10-year-old sedan. The engine sputtered slightly before roaring to life, a stark contrast to the smooth purr of the customized truck I had just saved from repossession. I drove through the quiet suburban streets of Ohio, with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. I did not turn on the radio. The silence inside the car was deafening, filled only with the steady rhythm of my own breathing. The drive took 45 minutes. Every mile that passed peeled away another layer of the wife I used to be. By the time I reached the private access road leading to the Oak Haven, my heart was beating with a slow and terrifying calm. I bypassed the main valet entrance. I knew Thomas would have parked his lifted truck right in the front to show off. Sure enough, there it was sitting proudly under the covered portico, gleaming in the afternoon sun. I drove around to the overflow parking lot in the back. I parked my modest car under the heavy shade of an old oak tree, completely out of sight. I stepped out of the car. I was still wearing my faded college shirt and gray sweatpants. I looked like a woman who had just finished cleaning out a garage, not a woman who belonged at a luxury resort. I walked around the perimeter of the property, staying close to the tall, manicured hedges. The hotel featured a massive outdoor stone terrace that overlooked a private lake. The terrace was dotted with intimate seating areas, fire pits, and plush outdoor sofas, separated by heavy wooden trellises covered in climbing ivy. It was designed to give guests the illusion of total privacy. I moved silently along the stone path that ran just below the terrace wall. I could hear the clinking of expensive crystal glasses. I could hear soft jazz playing from hidden outdoor speakers. And then I heard his voice. It was that loud, confident, booming laugh. The exact same laugh he used when he was boasting to his mother at my dining room table. The sound of it sent a physical shockwave through my chest. I stopped moving. I pressed my back flat against the cold stone of the retaining wall. I was positioned directly below one of the elevated seating areas. The thick ivy completely shielded me from view, but the acoustic design of the terrace meant I could hear every single word spoken above me with crystal clarity. I looked up through a small gap in the dark green leaves. I saw him first. Thomas was leaning back on a white cushioned sofa, holding a tall glass of amber liquid. He looked completely relaxed. He looked like a king surveying his kingdom. Then I saw her. She was sitting sideways on his lap, with one arm draped casually around his neck. She looked incredibly young. I would guess she was no more than 24 years old. She had long dark hair, flawless skin, and was wearing a designer silk dress that clung to her perfectly. She was beautiful in a vibrant, effortless way. She was exactly the kind of woman a fragile man uses to prove his own worth to the world. On her left wrist, catching the sunlight every time she moved her hand, was a brilliant diamond tennis bracelet. The exact same bracelet I had tracked through his shell company accounts that very morning. I did not gasp. I did not scream. I did not feel the sudden, overwhelming urge to run up the stairs and confront them. The media always portrays betrayed wives throwing drinks, causing a massive public scene, and crying uncontrollably. But in real life, true betrayal does not make you loud. It makes you incredibly quiet. I stood perfectly still in the shadows and simply listened. The young woman traced the rim of her cocktail glass with a manicured finger. She leaned her head against his shoulder and sighed. "I am just getting so tired of waiting, Tommy," she said. Her voice was soft, carrying a hint of practiced pout. "You promised me we would be looking at furniture for the downtown apartment this weekend. I hate that you have to keep going back to that miserable house in the suburbs. It feels like you are never actually going to leave her." Thomas stroked her hair affectionately. He took a sip of his drink and chuckled. "I told you to be patient, baby," he said smoothly. "These things take careful timing. You know I cannot stand being in that house any more than you can stand me being there. Clara is exhausting. She is like living with a human calculator. There is zero passion, zero vision. She just sits in her sweatpants all day typing on her little computer." I closed my eyes. The words were cruel, but they were exactly what I expected him to say. He needed to diminish me to elevate himself. "Then why do you stay?" the young woman asked, sounding genuinely frustrated. "You are building this massive real estate empire. You are going to be a millionaire. You do not need a boring bookkeeper dragging you down. Just pack your bags and move into the city with me tonight." Thomas laughed again. It was a dark, cynical sound. He leaned forward and lowered his voice, adopting the tone of a seasoned business executive, explaining a complex strategy to a junior employee. "Because, my love, you do not walk away from an asset until you have liquidated it," he said. My eyes snapped open. The blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. "Clara is not a wife anymore." Thomas continued, his voice dripping with pure calculation. "She is a financial anchor, and right now I am using her to secure the capital we need for our future. That house she bought before we got married has over $300,000 in pure equity sitting right inside it. I have already drafted the home equity line of credit paperwork. I gave it to her yesterday." The young woman sat up slightly, looking interested. "Did she sign it?" "Not yet," Thomas scoffed. "She threw a little temper tantrum this morning. She tried to tell me I was making a bad investment. Can you believe the audacity? A woman who makes $40,000 a year trying to lecture me about real estate development. But she will sign it. I pushed her hard last night. I threatened to walk out and leave her completely broke. She is terrified of being alone. By Monday morning, she will be crying, apologizing, and begging me to take the papers to the bank." I stood frozen against the stone wall. I stopped breathing entirely. "And what happens after she signs the papers?" the mistress asked, a greedy excitement creeping into her young voice. Thomas smiled. I could hear the absolute arrogance radiating from his words. "The bank approves the credit line based on the equity," he explained patiently. "The funds get deposited into a holding account that I control. Once that money clears, I am transferring the entire balance into my Zenith Holdings Corporation. That covers our apartment lease for the next 2 years, your new car, and the initial operating capital for my real estate firm." "What about Clara?" she asked. She did not sound sympathetic. She just sounded curious about the logistics of my destruction. "What about her?" Thomas replied coldly. "The moment that money hits my corporate account, I am serving her with divorce papers. Because her name is on the house, the home equity loan remains legally tied to the property. When I leave, she's going to be stuck with a massive loan she has absolutely no way of paying back on her pathetic little salary. The bank will foreclose on the house within 6 months. She will be completely bankrupt. And by the time the dust settles, you and I will be drinking champagne on a balcony overlooking the city skyline, entirely funded by her stupidity." The young woman giggled. It was a bright musical sound that echoed terribly against the stone wall. She kissed him deeply. "You are an absolute genius, Tommy. She really is just a stupid, boring little woman, isn't she?" "The stupidest," Thomas agreed, kissing her back. "Now stop worrying about my miserable wife and let's go enjoy our afternoon. The room is paid for until tomorrow." I heard the scraping of chair legs against the stone patio. I heard their footsteps retreating towards the glass doors of the hotel lobby. Within seconds, the terrace above me was completely silent, leaving only the sound of the soft jazz music and the gentle rustling of the oak trees in the wind. I did not move for a very long time. I stayed pressed against the cold retaining wall. I stared out at the private lake, watching the water ripple gently in the late afternoon breeze. I was waiting for the devastation to hit me. I was waiting for the tears to come. I was waiting for the familiar heavy crush of heartbreak, the agonizing realization that the man I had loved for 8 years was throwing me away for a younger woman. But the tears never came. The heartbreak never materialized. Instead, an incredibly profound transformation occurred deep inside my chest. It felt as though a heavy, suffocating wool blanket had been completely pulled off my mind. Every lingering drop of marital guilt, every ounce of self-doubt, every shred of hope that was instantly incinerated. I was not just a lazy husband who struggled with money. He was not just an insecure man seeking validation from a younger woman because he felt inadequate. He was an active, malicious predator. He had looked me in the eyes and promised to love and protect me. Meanwhile, he was actively engineering a plot to completely destroy my life. He wanted to strip away the home I had worked so hard to buy. He wanted to saddle me with hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent debt. He intended to orchestrate my absolute financial ruin simply to fund his new life with his mistress. He was literally planning to bankrupt me and leave me on the street, believing the entire time that I was too weak and too stupid to stop him. A slow, dangerous smile crept across my face. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a predator who has just realized the prey has willingly walked directly into a steel trap. He thought I was a terrified, low-level bookkeeper making $40,000 a year. He thought the threat of his absence would force me into submission. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against an unarmed opponent. I had no idea that I managed multi-million-dollar corporate acquisitions for a living. He had no idea that I earned $740,000 a year under a heavily protected legal entity. He had no idea that I was already 5 steps ahead of his pathetic little scheme. And most importantly, he had absolutely no idea that the woman he was trying to destroy no longer existed. The sad, accommodating wife who paid his debts and cried over his insults had died right here against this stone wall. The woman walking away from the Oak Haven Resort was a ruthless, calculating chief financial officer preparing for total corporate warfare. I stepped out of the shadows of the ivy trellis. I walked back to the overflow parking lot with my head held high and my shoulders pulled back. My steps were steady and full of purpose. I got back into my modest 10-year-old sedan and started the engine. I did not look back at the luxury hotel. I did not care what he and his mistress were doing in their expensive room. As I pulled out of the resort gates and merged onto the main highway heading back toward the suburbs, my mind was running through complex financial strategies at lightning speed. I knew exactly what I needed to do. The time for auditing was over. The time for passive observation was finished. I was going to let him believe his plan was working perfectly. I was going to smile. I was going to play the role of the defeated wife. I was going to hand him enough rope to hang himself 10 times over. And when the moment was exactly right, when he was standing at the absolute peak of his imaginary triumph, I was going to flip the board, seize every single asset he thought he controlled, and burn his fake empire entirely to the ground. He wanted a divorce. I was going to give him one. But he was going to walk away with absolutely nothing except the clothes on his back and a mountain of legal consequences. He thought I was a financial anchor. He was about to find out exactly how heavy an anchor could be when it was wrapped tightly around his neck and dropped into the deep ocean. I picked up my cell phone from the passenger seat and dialed the private number of the ruthless asset protection attorney I had called earlier that morning. "It is Clara Harding," I said when he answered. My voice was as hard and cold as diamonds. "Cancel the emergency consultation for Monday. We are moving faster than that. I need you to draft the absolute most aggressive asset protection and divorce filings your firm has ever created, and I need a strategy to legally acquire commercial debts. We are not just defending my assets anymore, we are going on the offensive." The heavy glass doors of the downtown law firm felt like a portal to an entirely different universe. I stepped off the elevator onto the 42nd floor, leaving behind the humid Ohio afternoon and entering a space of perfectly climate-controlled silence. I was not wearing my faded suburban sweatpants. I wore a sharp navy blazer and carried a structured leather briefcase that held the entire blueprint of my husband's destruction. For 8 years, I had played the role of the quiet and accommodating wife. I had allowed Thomas to treat me like a glorified calculator, while he drained my resources to fund his delusions of grandeur. But that version of Clara Harding no longer existed. She had evaporated the moment I heard Thomas laughing with his young mistress about leaving me bankrupt. I walked up to the mahogany reception desk with a singular focused purpose. I was not there to ask for a fair settlement. I was there to initiate a total financial liquidation. My appointment was with a senior partner named Gregory Sterling. I had spent hours researching attorneys the night before. I bypassed the mediators and the friendly family lawyers who advertised amicable separations. I searched specifically for litigators who specialized in high-stakes asset protection and hostile wealth division. Gregory Sterling possessed a reputation that terrified other lawyers. His retainer fee was monumental, but I had wired the funds from my secure corporate account without a single second of hesitation. An assistant led me into a massive corner conference room with expansive views of the city skyline. Gregory walked in a moment later. He was a man in his late 50s, with perceptive eyes and the rigid posture of a seasoned tactician. He did not offer a warm, comforting smile. He shook my hand firmly, sat down across the massive table, and opened a yellow legal pad. He asked me to outline the basic parameters of my marriage. His voice was clinical and completely detached. I kept my own voice equally flat and devoid of emotion as I narrated the reality of my situation. I explained that my husband believed I was a struggling freelance bookkeeper, earning $40,000 a year. I detailed Thomas's endless string of failed real estate ventures and the massive debts I had secretly paid off to keep our household afloat. I told Gregory about the recent $15,000 withdrawal from our joint account. I explained how Thomas was currently demanding that I sign a home equity line of credit against my house so he could fund a luxury apartment for his mistress before serving me with divorce papers. Gregory listened quietly while his gold pen tapped rhythmically against his notepad. He offered a slight practiced nod. To him, this was a painfully common narrative. He saw it all the time. An arrogant and financially abusive husband grossly underestimating a terrified and dependent wife. He leaned forward and assured me that we would aggressively defend the equity in my home and ensure I was not left completely destitute when Thomas eventually filed the paperwork. He spoke to me with the gentle condescension reserved for victims who desperately needed to be saved. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a tightly bound black binder. I slid it across the polished wood table directly in front of him. I looked him directly in the eyes and told him I did not come to his office just to defend my house. I told him I came to surgically dismantle my husband. Gregory opened the binder. The very first page was my certified corporate tax return for the previous year. His professional and detached expression completely vanished the exact second his eyes hit the bottom line. $740,000 in annual net revenue. He picked up the heavy premium paper and read the massive number again. Then he looked slowly up at me. The entire dynamic of the room shifted in an instant. The polite condescension evaporated into the cool, air-conditioned room. He realized he was not speaking to a frightened victim in need of a savior. He was speaking to a peer. He asked me exactly how long I had maintained this level of wealth without my husband discovering a single trace of it. I explained the complex and layered corporate structure of my fractional chief financial officer consultancy. I laid out the articles of incorporation for my limited liability company. I pointed out the specific dates of establishment, showing him that the corporate entity was legally formed 3 full years before I ever met Thomas. I provided a mountain of banking records, routing numbers, and transfer logs, demonstrating that not a single penny of my corporate revenue had ever been commingled with our joint marital accounts. I detailed my careful strategy of paying myself a very modest monthly salary into the joint account to maintain my cover story as a low-level clerk, while the massive bulk of my wealth remained securely locked inside diversified corporate investment portfolios. Gregory spent the next 45 minutes meticulously reviewing the corporate veil I had constructed. He verified the state registration laws. He checked the operating agreements. He traced the complex flow of capital and confirmed the absolute isolation of my business accounts. I watched him work in total silence. He was incredibly thorough and questioned every potential vulnerability. When he finally set his pen down, he leaned back in his heavy leather chair and let out a low, appreciative laugh. It was the distinct sound of a legal predator who had just been handed a perfectly executed and airtight case. He confirmed my structural integrity immediately. Because I had never commingled the funds and because the business entity strictly predated the marriage by several years, Thomas had absolutely zero legal claim to my corporate assets. My $740,000 annual income was 100% legally protected. Thomas truly believed he was going to walk away with half of everything while leaving me destitute in a roach-infested apartment. In reality, the only marital asset we legally shared was a joint checking account that Thomas himself had already drained down to absolute zero. The house was solely in my name, purchased well before the marriage, and my business was entirely shielded by an impenetrable fortress of legal separation. That fact alone was a devastating victory. It meant I was entirely safe. It meant Thomas would walk away with absolutely nothing. But I was not interested in simply being safe anymore. I wanted absolute and unyielding justice for 8 years of gaslighting, manipulation, and severe financial abuse. I turned to the second tab in my thick black binder. I pulled out a stack of documents related to the commercial loan Thomas had bragged about securing for his new real estate venture. During my relentless forensic audit over the weekend, I had managed to pull the complete loan origination file from his careless digital trail. I slid the heavy stack of official bank papers across the table to Gregory. I told Gregory that Thomas secured this specific capital late last week. I directed his attention to the third page of the commercial loan agreement. It was the personal guarantee section. The regional bank required a guarantor with excellent credit and significant collateral to underwrite a high-risk commercial loan for $40,000. Thomas had ruined his own credit years ago with his endless failed ventures. My credit, however, was absolutely flawless. Thomas had taken out this recent $40,000 loan using fraudulent documents where he completely forged my signature as a guarantor. I watched Gregory process the information. The silence in the corner conference room became incredibly dense. The ambient hum of the city traffic far below seemed to completely fade away, leaving only the sound of my own steady breathing. Gregory stopped smiling entirely. He picked up the document and held it closer to the natural light streaming through the massive windows. He examined the digital notary stamp, the date of execution, and the forged ink with extreme predatory scrutiny. It was a remarkably clumsy attempt to mimic my handwriting. The loops were entirely wrong. The pressure was uneven. The slant leaned in the complete opposite direction of my actual signature. He set the paper down very slowly on the polished wood. He took a deep and measured breath. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a grave and absolute weight that commanded the entire room. This was not a petty marital dispute over a hidden credit card or a secret bank account withdrawal. The exact moment Thomas transmitted those forged documents to secure his funding, he crossed a line he could never uncross. Gregory explained that the federal government does not care about messy divorces or marital infidelity, but they care deeply and aggressively about individuals defrauding their banking system. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the heavy mahogany table, and detailed the severe reality of these specific offenses. Submitting a falsified signature to a federally insured financial institution to secure commercial capital constitutes bank fraud. Because the fraudulent documents were transmitted electronically across banking networks, it also constitutes wire fraud. The lawyer explained this is a federal crime. The maximum penalty for such a violation could carry decades in federal prison alongside crippling financial restitution. Furthermore, Gregory explained that Thomas had also compromised a notary public. If Thomas had paid, manipulated, or colluded with a notary to illegally stamp a legal document without my physical presence verifying my identity, that was another severe criminal offense. My husband was building a fragile house of cards out of state, and federal violations entirely oblivious to the gale force wind that was about to blow it all down. I thought he was just outsmarting his simple and gullible wife. He thought he was a genius businessman, leveraging assets to build his empire. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed the federal authorities the exact rope they needed to hang him. A profound and terrifying sense of power washed over me, settling deep into my bones. For 8 long years, I had suppressed my own intelligence. I had purposely dumbed down my vocabulary so Thomas would not feel threatened. I had pretended not to understand basic economics while secretly managing multi-million-dollar spreadsheets. I had shrunk myself to fit inside his incredibly fragile ego, tiptoeing around his unpredictable temper, paying his endless debts, and swallowing my pride just to keep the peace in a house that I paid for. Just days ago, he had towered over my desk, screaming in my face and threatened to leave me destitute. He had laughed with his young mistress on a hotel terrace about draining my home equity and discarding me like garbage. And now I was sitting in a corner office on the 42nd floor, looking at a single piece of paper that held the power to completely destroy his entire existence. I did not just hold the keys to his financial ruin. I held his actual freedom in the palm of my hand. Gregory watched my face carefully. He had seen clients break down in tears when they realized their spouse had committed a serious crime. He had seen clients panic, backtrack, and ask how to protect their family from the devastating legal fallout. He watched me, waiting to see if the suburban wife would resurface and beg for mercy on behalf of her husband. I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I reached across the mahogany table and tapped my index finger firmly against the forged signature. I looked at the most ruthless lawyer in the state and asked him exactly how we were going to use this to build a trap my husband could never escape. Gregory let out a low, sharp laugh. He recognized instantly that we were no longer fighting a defensive battle. We were going on the absolute offensive. Gregory outlined the initial strategy with cold, clinical precision. He advised me not to confront Thomas about the forgery yet. He told me to let Thomas continue to believe he was in total control of the narrative. The strategy was to let him spend the stolen money. Let him sign the commercial lease for his luxury apartment downtown. Let him buy expensive gifts for his mistress. Let him dig the hole so deep that climbing out would be mathematically and legally impossible. Meanwhile, Gregory and his team of paralegals would begin preparing a devastating legal strike. They would draft a comprehensive divorce petition, claiming all marital assets while explicitly rejecting all of his fraudulently acquired debts. They would compile a pristine evidence packet detailing the bank fraud, the unauthorized wire transfers, and the forged notary stamps ready to hand over to the authorities at the exact right moment. I agreed to the plan immediately. I authorized Gregory to utilize whatever legal and financial resources were necessary to prepare the filings. I wanted the trap to be so perfectly constructed that by the time Thomas realized the steel jaws had snapped shut, he would already be completely immobilized. We spent another 2 hours finalizing the logistics. We established secure communication channels that completely bypassed my personal phone. We mapped out every single detail on Gregory's legal pad. When I finally stood up to leave this conference room, my legs felt incredibly solid beneath me. I shook Gregory by the hand. He looked at me with genuine professional respect. He told me he had been practicing asset protection for 30 years, and he had never seen a spouse prepare such a flawless counterattack. I walked out of the law firm and rode the silent elevator back down to the massive marble lobby. I stepped out into the bustling downtown streets. The intense afternoon sun was shining brightly, reflecting off the glass towers around me. I took a deep breath of the thick city air. I thought about Thomas sitting in a coffee shop somewhere, bragging to his imaginary business partners about his new real estate empire. He was entirely oblivious to the massive storm gathering directly above his head. I got back into my modest 10-year-old sedan, ready to go home and play the role of the obedient, terrified wife to absolute perfection because I knew exactly how the final act was going to end. The architecture of modern wealth is built on absolute secrecy. I sat in my home office on Tuesday morning and initiated a sequence of financial maneuvers that would permanently seal my husband's fate. I did not use my personal banking accounts. I bypassed my standard corporate channels completely. Instead, I contacted a highly specialized corporate broker located in Delaware. I instructed him to establish a blind proxy corporation. A blind proxy is a shell company that exists solely on paper designed specifically to mask the true identity of its owner from public records and financial institutions. We named the entity Vanguard Asset Management. Within 48 hours, the corporation was legally active, registered, and completely untraceable to Clara Harding. I wired $50,000 of my own heavily protected corporate capital into Vanguard Asset Management. Once the funds cleared, my broker immediately contacted the small regional bank that had issued Thomas his fraudulent commercial loan. Regional financial institutions absolutely despise carrying high-risk commercial debt generated by individuals with terrible credit histories. My broker presented them with a standard corporate buyout offer. He proposed that Vanguard Asset Management purchase Thomas's entire $40,000 commercial note at face value, plus a 5% premium to cover administrative transferring costs. The bank executives accepted the deal without a single moment of hesitation. They were thrilled to offload a toxic asset to an anonymous corporate buyer. By Wednesday afternoon, the transaction was officially complete. The regional bank electronically transferred the promissory note, the forged personal guarantee documents, and all absolute legal rights of collection directly to my proxy company. I sat staring at my dual monitors, watching the encrypted confirmation files load onto my private server. I downloaded the digital portfolio and printed the master agreement. I held the heavy premium paper in my hands. The reality of the situation was staggering. Thomas believed he had successfully swindled a faceless bank to secure the capital required to lease his luxury downtown apartment and purchase diamond bracelets for his young mistress. I believed he was an unstoppable financial genius, manipulating the system to his absolute advantage. I had no idea that the bank no longer owned his debt. I did. I had legally weaponized my wealth to become his sole and primary creditor. I literally owned his financial obligations. If he missed a single monthly payment or violated a single covenant of the commercial loan agreement, I held the unilateral power to call in the entire debt, demand immediate total repayment, and trigger a catastrophic civil lawsuit. And because I possessed the physical proof that he had forged my signature to secure the initial capital, I held the trigger to a federal bank fraud investigation. I had wrapped a steel cable around his neck, and he was entirely oblivious to the fact that I held the other end. The time for corporate warfare was paused. It was time to return to domestic theater. I left my office and walked downstairs to the kitchen to prepare for his arrival. I needed to construct a scenario that would feed his massive ego and blind him to the danger closing in around him. I spent an hour cooking a cheap generic meal of boxed macaroni and cheese. I wanted the house to smell like struggle and mediocrity. I wanted the environment to perfectly reflect the fabricated poverty I was about to present to him. Before coming downstairs, I had spent the afternoon manufacturing a masterfully deceptive financial portfolio. I took my legitimate baseline bank statements and heavily redacted them. I altered the income columns using professional accounting software. I created a fake household budget spreadsheet that showed us absolutely drowning in overdue utility bills and mounting grocery costs. I built a narrative on paper that proved my small freelance bookkeeping business was completely collapsing. Thomas arrived home at 6 in the evening. He walked through the front door striding with the swagger of a newly minted millionaire. He was wearing a brand-new tailored designer suit that he had undoubtedly purchased using the money he had stolen from our joint emergency fund. He smelled of expensive cologne and unfiltered arrogance. He dropped his leather briefcase on the kitchen island and looked at the simple bowl of macaroni I placed on the dining table. His upper lip curled in profound disgust. He asked me if this was some kind of joke. He complained that he had spent the entire day negotiating massive real estate contracts and dealing with high-level contractors, and he expected a real meal. He told me I'd been sitting at home all day in my pajamas, and the least I could do was buy a decent cut of meat for my hardworking husband. I did not argue with him. I did not point out that his new suit cost more than our monthly property taxes. I kept my shoulders slumped and my gaze directed at the floor. I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up the stack of fabricated financial documents. I forced my hands to tremble slightly. I took a deep, shaky breath and brought the papers to the dining table. I told him I could not afford to buy a decent cut of meat. I kept my voice incredibly small and hesitant. I pushed the heavily redacted spreadsheets across the polished wood table toward him. I looked up at him with wide, watery eyes, playing the role of the terrified and helpless wife to absolute perfection. I told him I had run the household numbers just like he had demanded over the weekend. I manufactured a slight sob in my throat. I confessed that my two biggest freelance clients had unexpectedly dropped my services that morning. I pointed a shaking finger at the fake negative balances on the spreadsheet. I told him my income had completely dried up and my small savings were entirely gone. I told him we were completely out of money and I was absolutely terrified that we were going to lose the house. Thomas stopped complaining about his dinner. He looked down at the papers. He picked up the fabricated spreadsheets and scanned the red numbers. I watched his face carefully. I expected him to show at least a fraction of concern for our household stability. I expected him to panic about the utility bills or the grocery budget. I did none of those things. A slow, cruel smile spread across his handsome face. He looked at the paper, and then he looked at me. He actually laughed. It was a loud, booming sound of pure, unadulterated triumph that echoed harshly off the kitchen tiles. He threw the papers back onto the table with a dismissive flick of his wrist. He leaned back in his dining chair and crossed his arms, looking at me with absolute contempt. He did not comfort me. He gloated. He told me he was not surprised in the slightest. He called me a glorified calculator who lacked the basic intelligence required to sustain a real business. He said my failure was entirely predictable because I possessed zero vision and zero natural ambition. He reminded me of the cruel things he had said to me days ago. He proudly repeated his claim that without his massive earning potential, I would die broke in a miserable one-bedroom apartment. He pointed at the fake negative numbers and said this was exactly why women should not try to play business in the real world. He told me his mother Barbara had always warned him that I was a financial anchor dragging him down. He said he was exhausted from carrying my dead weight while trying to build his empire. I sat perfectly still and absorbed every single insult. I let him mock my intelligence. I let him ridicule my fabricated poverty. Every cruel word he spoke only cemented my absolute resolve to destroy him. Then he leaned forward and tapped his index finger hard against the wooden table. He told me that my complete financial failure was exactly why I needed to submit to his authority immediately. He said that since my pathetic little business was dead, the equity in this house was our only remaining lifeline. He framed his fraudulent real estate venture as the ultimate and only salvation for my incompetence. He told me I had absolutely no choice but to sign the home equity line of credit paperwork now because I was financially worthless without his brilliant investments. He demanded that I sign the bank documents first thing in the morning so he could secure the final funding to save our family from my massive mistakes. He spoke with the absolute authority of a savior addressing a grateful and desperate peasant. I nodded slowly, letting a single fabricated tear fall down my cheek. I told him he was right. I told him I was so sorry for doubting his vision. I promised him I would sign the home equity paperwork tomorrow morning after I had one more night to mourn the loss of my bookkeeping business. I told him I trusted him completely to manage our future. Thomas stood up from the table, practically glowing with victory. He adjusted the crisp cuffs of his stolen designer suit. He told me he was glad I had finally accepted reality and learned my place. He said he was going out to celebrate a new contract with his business partners and would not be home until very late. He told me to clean up the kitchen and get some sleep because I looked terrible. I sat at the table and listened to the front door close. I heard the heavy engine of his customized truck roar to life and fade away down the dark suburban street. I was rushing off to his luxury hotel to drink expensive champagne with his young mistress, completely convinced that he had broken my spirit and secured his massive payout. He truly believed he was the undisputed master of his universe. The tears dried instantly on my face. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. I stood up from the table and picked up the fabricated financial documents. I dropped them into the trash can. I did not feel sad. I felt a profound cold and absolute satisfaction. Thomas was walking around celebrating his superiority, entirely blind to the massive legal noose that was now pulled tight around his throat. He thought I was out of money. He thought I was defeated. He had absolutely no idea that the woman he had just mocked and insulted was the exact same woman who now legally owned every single debt his fragile fake empire was built upon. It was a warm Saturday evening when we pulled through the towering wrought iron gates of the Oak Bridge Country Club. Thomas was driving his lifted truck, the very same vehicle I had saved from repossession just weeks prior. He gripped the leather steering wheel with relaxed confidence, whistling along to the radio. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the manicured golf courses and perfectly rolling green hills. During the entire 40-minute drive from our house, Thomas had lectured me about my attitude. He told me to put on a happy face. He explicitly instructed me not to bring up our fabricated financial troubles, because he did not want my depressing energy to ruin his mother's special night. I had simply nodded, keeping my hands folded in my lap, playing the role of the defeated and compliant wife to absolute perfection. Oak Bridge was an incredibly exclusive establishment known for its exorbitant membership fees and elite clientele. This was the venue Thomas had selected for Barbara's 60th birthday celebration. When we handed the keys to the valet and walked up the sweeping marble steps, I took a moment to calculate the exact cost of the evening. I knew the pricing sheet because I had intercepted the email confirmations during my forensic audit. The private banquet room rental, the premium open bar, the 5-course catered meal, featuring prime rib and lobster, and the towering artisan cake came to a grand total of $12,000. It was a spectacular and breathtaking display of wealth, and it was funded entirely by the money Thomas had stolen from our joint emergency account. Walking into the private banquet hall felt like stepping directly onto a brightly lit theater stage, where every single person was performing a massive delusion except me. There were about 50 guests mingling under the glittering crystal chandeliers. Extended family members, longtime neighbors, and people Thomas loosely referred to as business associates were dressed in their absolute best. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated through the room, carrying silver trays of expensive champagne and delicate appetizers. Barbara stood at the very center of the room, holding court like a reigning queen. She was wearing a stunning floor-length gown and a brand-new sapphire necklace that caught the light every time she moved. I recognized the necklace immediately. I had tracked the exact wire transfer from Thomas's fraudulent shell company directly to the downtown jeweler who sold it. My stolen money was literally sparkling against my mother-in-law's neck. Jessica was standing right next to her mother wearing a designer silk dress that easily cost $2,000. She had undoubtedly funded her entire high-fashion wardrobe with the weekly allowance Thomas secretly transferred to her checking account. They looked wealthy. They looked powerful. They looked completely untouched by the reality of the world. The moment I entered the room alongside Thomas, the illusion of my place in this family was made perfectly clear. Barbara spotted her son, and her face lit up with pure joy. She rushed forward and threw her arms around his neck, thanking him loudly for giving her the most incredible birthday of her life. She kissed his cheek and told him he was the greatest son a mother could ever ask for. Then her eyes shifted to me. The warmth vanished from her face instantly, replaced by a look of mild irritation. She did not offer me a hug. She did not thank me for coming. She simply handed me her empty champagne flute and pointed toward the bar across the room. She told me the servers were moving far too slowly and asked me to fetch her a fresh drink with a twist of lemon. Without missing a beat, she added that I should go check on the kitchen staff to ensure the prime rib would be served exactly at 7 o'clock, because her friends were getting hungry. She spoke to me with the casual, dismissive authority one uses with a hired catering assistant. I took her empty glass. I did not argue. I did not roll my eyes. I walked to the bar, retrieved her drink, and checked on the kitchen exactly as commanded. For the next hour, I moved through the room collecting discarded cocktail napkins and directing late-arriving guests to their assigned tables. An elderly uncle snapped his fingers at me to ask for a glass of sparkling water. A distant cousin handed me her heavy wool coat and told me to find the cloakroom. I obliged every single request. During the cocktail hour, I found myself standing near a high-top table where Barbara and Jessica were talking with two wealthy women from their tennis club. I was arranging fresh napkins on the table when one of the women complimented the massive ice sculpture sitting in the center of the room. Barbara smiled graciously and credited her brilliant son. She told her friends that Thomas was closing massive commercial real estate deals and that he insisted on spoiling her. Jessica noticed me standing there and smiled a sharp, predatory smile. She looked at my simple black dress and asked me how my little bookkeeping hobby was going. She used a tone of voice drenched in fake sympathy. She told her mother's friends that it was such a shame my freelance business was failing right when Thomas was carrying so much responsibility. Barbara sighed theatrically and patted my arm. She told me that I should really just focus on keeping the house clean, so Thomas could concentrate on his empire. She said that a successful man needs a supportive home environment, not a wife who stresses him out with her own petty failures. I looked at the two women living entirely on my stolen wealth. I looked at their expensive jewelry and their perfectly styled hair. I felt a deep, steady rhythm of absolute satisfaction beating in my chest. Every time they insulted my intelligence, every time they handed me an empty plate, the legal trap I had constructed felt stronger. They thought they were putting me in my place. They thought they were the royalty of the evening. They had no idea. They were simply dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, while I held the only key to the lifeboats. I smiled politely at Barbara, agreed that Thomas was certainly working very hard, and walked away to collect more empty glasses. Thomas spent the entire hour working the room with practiced arrogance. He shook hands with his uncles, slapped his cousins on the back, and loudly discussed his imaginary real estate empire. He made sure everyone within a 20-foot radius could hear about his new commercial properties and the massive capital investments he had recently secured. I stood by the kitchen doors and watched him boast to an older family friend about the $40,000 commercial loan he had just closed. He claimed it was a testament to his brilliant market strategy and his flawless business reputation. He puffed out his chest and spoke with total authority, completely blind to the fact that the quiet woman clearing appetizer plates behind him legally owned that exact debt. At 8 o'clock. The banquet hall doors were closed, and the guests took their seats at the grand dining table. The seating arrangement was incredibly telling. Thomas was seated at the head of the table in a high-backed chair right next to Barbara and Jessica. They were surrounded by the most important and influential guests in the family. I was placed at the absolute opposite end of the long table, seated right next to the swinging kitchen doors. My dinner companion was a teenage nephew who spent the entire first course ignoring me to play games on his phone. The dinner was a lavish affair. Course after course of expensive food was brought out by the waitstaff. Thomas held court at his end of the table, laughing loudly and pouring expensive wine for his mother's friends. He looked like a king surveying a kingdom he had built with his own two hands. He was drunk on his own ego, fueled by the adoration of a room full of people who believed his carefully constructed lies. When the dessert plates were finally cleared and the coffee was poured, the lights in the room dimmed slightly. Thomas stood up from his chair. He picked up his heavy silver spoon and tapped it gently against his crystal champagne flute. The chiming sound brought the room to an immediate and respectful silence. 50 faces turned toward the head of the table. Thomas adjusted his tailored suit jacket, smoothed his expensive silk tie, and smiled warmly at his captive audience. He began his speech by praising his mother. He spoke eloquently about Barbara's strength, her elegance, and her unwavering belief in his potential. He told the room that a man only reaches the peak of his success when he has a mother who teaches him how to conquer the world. He raised his glass to her, and the older relatives in the room dabbed their eyes with linen napkins. Barbara beamed, reaching out to squeeze his hand with tears of pride shining in her eyes. Then his tone shifted. The warm, loving son routine melted away, instantly replaced by the swaggering persona of a self-made tycoon. He looked out over the crowd intentionally, letting his gaze sweep over the guests while bypassing me completely. He began to talk about the brutal realities of the business world. He told the room that true success is a heavy and isolating burden. He said that building an empire from nothing requires ruthless dedication, sleepless nights, and a willingness to carry the massive financial weight of an entire household on his shoulders alone. I sat perfectly still at the far end of the table. I watched his mouth move. I listened to this man, a man who had never paid a single utility bill or contributed a dime to our mortgage, confidently claim credit for the roof over our heads and the food on our table. He spoke beautifully about the sacrifices he had made to ensure his family never went without. He painted himself as a tireless provider who worked himself to the bone while receiving absolutely no help from anyone. Thomas raised his glass a little higher, the liquid catching the light of the chandelier. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of solemn wisdom. He told the silent room that sometimes on the path to ultimate greatness, a man has to drag dead weight along with him until he is finally strong enough to cut the cord. He looked directly down the length of the table at me then. A cold, cruel, and condescending smirk touched the corners of his mouth. He did not say my name out loud, but he absolutely did not need to. The entire room felt the sudden sharp shift in the atmosphere. A heavy, uncomfortable tension settled over the guests. A few people shifted awkwardly in their velvet chairs, their eyes darting between Thomas and me. From her seat near the head of the table, Jessica let out a soft, highly audible laugh of agreement. Thomas held my gaze for a fraction of a second to ensure I felt the full force of his public humiliation, and then he turned his attention back to his mother. He announced that his new real estate ventures had secured massive funding and were about to yield unprecedented returns. He promised Barbara that next year they would not be celebrating her birthday in a local country club. He promised her they would be celebrating on a private yacht in the Mediterranean. He puffed out his chest completely, commanding the room, and declared that he was officially moving on to bigger and better things. He used those exact words, letting them hang in the air for everyone to absorb. It was a thinly veiled, arrogant promise to his family and his friends that he was actively preparing to leave his mediocre, low-earning, and useless wife behind so he could step fully into his wealthy new life. He finished his toast by raising his glass to the ceiling, dedicating the evening to his mother and to a future filled with boundless prosperity. The room erupted. The applause was deafening. People stood up from their chairs, raising their flutes and cheering for the brilliant, successful patriarch of the Harding family. Barbara stood up and hugged him tightly, weeping with absolute joy. I did not stand up. I did not applaud. I sat at the end of the long table near the kitchen doors with my hands folded neatly in my lap. I looked down the length of the room at the man I had married 8 years ago. He was glowing with unearned pride, surrounded by a family of entitled parasites who worshipped the money he had stolen from me. He truly believed he had reached the absolute summit of his life. He believed he had successfully humiliated me in front of his entire extended family, established his total dominance, and paved the way for his grand exit. He did not know that sitting quietly inside my structured leather tote bag, resting right against the leg of my chair, was a thick bound folder containing the absolute destruction of his entire reality. He did not know that his arrogant speech about carrying the financial weight of our household was the perfect theatrical introduction for the performance I was about to deliver. I reached down and rested my hand on the cool leather of my bag. I took a slow, measured sip of my ice water. I let the thunderous applause wash over me, allowing Thomas to enjoy his final fleeting moments of absolute delusion, savoring the crisp and cold reality that I was about to end him. The applause inside the Oak Bridge Country Club banquet hall was deafening. 50 guests rose to their feet, raising their crystal champagne flutes, to honor the man sitting at the head of the table. Thomas soaked in their adoration with a broad, victorious smile. He looked exactly like the successful self-made tycoon he had spent 8 years pretending to be. Barbara was weeping tears of pure joy into her linen napkin, leaning over to kiss her brilliant son on the cheek. Jessica was clapping loudly, her expensive silk dress shimmering under the light of the massive chandeliers. They were a perfect portrait of American wealth and familial loyalty. I sat at the far end of the long dining table, completely perfectly still. I did not raise my glass. I did not clap my hands. I just watched them perform their grand delusion. When the applause finally began to fade, and the guests started to take their seats, the room settled into a warm, comfortable murmur. This was the exact moment Thomas expected me to shrink away into the background. He expected me to stare at my lap, humiliated by his thinly veiled public threat about moving on to bigger and better things. He expected me to spend the entire car ride home apologizing for holding him back and begging him not to leave me. Instead, I stood up. The heavy wooden legs of my dining chair scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor. The sound was sharp enough to cut through the lingering chatter. A few heads turned in my direction, their expressions a mixture of mild curiosity and polite confusion. I reached down and picked up my structured leather briefcase from the floor. I did not rush. I walked with slow, deliberate, measured steps down the entire length of the grand dining table. I passed aunts, uncles, and family friends who had spent the last 2 hours treating me like the hired catering staff. The room grew progressively quieter with every single step I took. By the time I reached the head of the table, where Thomas, Barbara, and Jessica were seated, the banquet hall was wrapped in absolute suffocating silence. Thomas looked up at me, his handsome face twisted into a mask of sudden irritation and embarrassment. He thought I was going to make an emotional scene. He thought I was going to cry. He leaned back in his high-backed chair and let out a soft, patronizing sigh, ready to dismiss me. I stepped directly up to the microphone he had left standing on the small podium near his seat. I adjusted the metal stand. A sharp burst of audio feedback echoed through the room, making a few guests flinch in their seats. I looked out over the sea of well-dressed people. Then I turned my head and looked directly down at my husband. "I want to thank Thomas for that incredibly moving speech," I said. My voice was calm, pleasant, and chillingly polite. It echoed crisply through the quiet room. He is absolutely right about one thing. He has been incredibly busy lately. Building an empire from scratch is truly exhausting work. Thomas narrowed his dark eyes. He did not know how to process my tone. He was actively searching my face for signs of weakness or panic, but there were none to find. I was a fortress of absolute calm. In fact, I continued unlatching the heavy brass clasps of my leather briefcase. Thomas has been working so incredibly hard behind the scenes that I felt it was only appropriate to share the actual tangible fruits of his labor with the people he loves most. After all, as he just said, family comes first. I reached deep into the briefcase and pulled out 3 thick, tightly bound black folders. They were heavy, filled with hundreds of pages of forensic accounting, wire transfer receipts, IP address logs, and digital communication records. I had spent hours color-coding and highlighting every single fraudulent transaction. I walked over to Barbara first. She looked at me with open distaste as I gently placed the first black folder onto her silver charger plate, right next to her half-eaten slice of artisan cake. I handed the second folder to Jessica, who stared at it as if I had just handed her a live explosive device. Finally, I placed the third and thickest folder directly on the table in front of Thomas. "What exactly is this, Clara?" Thomas asked. His voice was low-laced with a dangerous warning. He pushed the folder an inch away from his chest, refusing to open the cover. "If this is another one of your little accounting spreadsheets, now is absolutely not the time. Sit down and stop embarrassing yourself in front of my guests." "Open it, Thomas," I said, my voice projecting clearly through the microphone. Open it and show everyone the glorious empire you built. He refused to touch it, but Barbara, driven by her innate curiosity and her absolute blind confidence in her son, flipped open the heavy black cover of her folder. Her eyes scanned the very first page. It was a brightly colored summary graph detailing the financial flow of a Delaware-based shell company called Zenith Holdings. Her brow furrowed in deep confusion. I know numbers can be tedious for those who do not study them, I said to the silent crowd, my voice carrying with effortless authority. So let me translate the complex financial data for everyone in the room tonight. For the past 8 years, my husband has claimed to be a real estate visionary. He has demanded absolute respect and submission from his household while forcing us to tighten our belts and make severe financial sacrifices. But the truth, as outlined in the legal documents sitting before him, is an entirely different story. I turned my unwavering gaze to Barbara. On page 4 of your folder, Barbara, you will find the bank routing details for a weekly transfer of exactly $1,500. That is $6,000 a month. That money was taken directly from my personal emergency savings account and wired to a shell corporation, which then wired it directly to you. My money has been funding your country club memberships, your luxury vacations, and the heavy sapphire necklace you are currently wearing around your neck. Barbara gasped loudly. Her hand flew up to clutch the blue stones resting against her collarbone. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking old and terrified. And on page 7, I continued, smoothly turning my attention to my sister-in-law. You will find the certified banking records of an $800 weekly transfer sent directly to Jessica to finance her designer wardrobe and her expensive spa weekends. The two of you have spent years sitting at my dining room table eating the premium food I bought, drinking the vintage wine I selected, and telling me I was a terrible, unsupportive wife. You told me I needed to respect the man who provided for me. You simply did not know that I was the one providing for you. Your entire luxurious lifestyle has been a direct parasitic drain on my personal bank accounts. The banquet hall erupted into shocked gasps and hushed frantic whispers. Extended family members craned their necks, desperately trying to see the papers on the table. A woman near the back of the room covered her mouth with both of her hands. "Clara, shut your mouth right now," Thomas hissed. His face had turned a deep, furious shade of crimson. He stood up from his chair abruptly, his fists clenched tight at his sides. He looked like he wanted to physically drag me away from the podium. "I am not finished," I said loudly. My voice sliced through his anger like a sharpened steel blade. I did not step back. I held my ground perfectly. Because the secret family allowance was only a minor fraction of the theft. If you turn to page 12 in your binders, you will find the commercial lease agreement for a luxury penthouse apartment in downtown Columbus. The rent is $5,000 a month. It is currently occupied by a 24-year-old woman who is wearing a diamond tennis bracelet purchased with $15,000 stolen from my joint checking account just last week. I tracked the credit card receipts directly to a boutique hotel where they spent the afternoon laughing about how easily they were going to bankrupt me. The room descended into total, unmitigated chaos. The whispers turned into loud exclamations of disgust. Several of Barbara's wealthy friends stared at Thomas with undisguised horror and revulsion. Jessica dropped her folder onto the floor, the papers spilling out over the expensive rugs. Barbara let out a strangled sobbing sound and slumped back into her dining chair, pressing her linen napkin against her face. Her perfect, meticulously crafted social reputation was incinerating in real time in front of everyone she desperately wanted to impress. You have been listening to a man boast about carrying the massive financial weight of his household, I declared, my voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. But the absolute reality is that Thomas has not generated a single dollar of legitimate profit in 8 years. He is a total fraud. He has ruined his credit, defaulted on multiple business loans, and relied entirely on my daily income to maintain the pathetic illusion of his success while actively planning to leave me completely destitute. Thomas finally snapped. The charming, polished facade of the successful businessman shattered into a million pieces revealing the desperate, aggressive bully hiding underneath. He kicked his heavy chair backward so violently it crashed into the wall behind him, leaving a deep dent in the plaster. He marched right up to the podium, towering over me, his broad chest heaving with uncontrolled rage. "You vindictive, crazy woman!" he screamed, completely abandoning any attempt at public decency or decorum. Saliva flew from his lips. The veins in his thick neck bulged dangerously against his expensive silk tie. "You think these stupid little papers mean anything? You think you can embarrass me in front of my family and my business partners and just get away with it?" He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at my face. "I am absolutely done with you. I am filing for divorce tomorrow morning. And let me tell you exactly what is going to happen to you, Clara. I am going to take half of that house. I am going to take half of your pathetic little retirement savings. I am going to demand permanent alimony. I am going to hire the most ruthless lawyers in this entire state, and I am going to bleed you entirely dry. I told you that you would die. Broke in a miserable, roach-infested apartment, and I am going to make sure that happens. You are nothing but a glorified calculator, and you own absolutely nothing without me." He stood there breathing heavily, glaring down at me, waiting for me to break. He expected the tears to start flowing. He expected the panic to set in. He truly thought the threat of legal destruction and total abandonment would finally force me to submit and apologize, just like it always had in the past. I looked at him. I did not blink. I reached into my structured leather briefcase one final time. I pulled out a single thin manila folder. I placed it gently on the top of the wooden podium, opened the cover, and slid a stack of heavy, watermarked premium paper across the polished wood, directly toward his chest. "Those are my certified corporate tax returns for the past 3 years, I said. My voice dropped to a low, commanding register that forced the entire room to fall dead silent and strain to listen. "I strongly suggest you read the bottom line." Thomas looked down at the official government documents. His dark eyes scanned the first page. He blinked rapidly, clearly struggling to comprehend the massive numbers printed in the black ink. He read the bottom line. Then he read it again. All the angry color instantly vanished from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw went completely slack. The furious, intimidating fire in his eyes was extinguished in a fraction of a second, replaced by a sudden blank, and absolute terror. $740,000 a year, Thomas, I said smoothly. The number hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. A collective gasp rippled through the entire banquet hall. I am not a freelance bookkeeper making pennies. I am the acting chief financial officer for 3 major technology firms in Silicon Valley. I structured my massive income under a heavily protected limited liability company 3 years before I ever met you. You have absolutely no legal claim to a single penny of my wealth. You thought you were outsmarting a low-level clerk who was desperate for your affection. You had absolutely no idea you were married to a corporate financial executive. He stumbled backward, shaking his head side to side in denial. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking into a high pitch. "That is impossible. You make 40 grand. You sit in your pajamas all day. I am the one who quietly paid your maxed-out credit card debts." I continued, stepping around the wooden podium to close the distance between us. "I am the one who paid the federal government when you ignored your back taxes and faced prison time. I am the one who kept you out of a jail cell and put the premium food on this table while you played pretend businessman for your mother." I leaned in closer. The entire room was holding its collective breath. I could hear the faint, frantic sound of Barbara weeping behind him, finally realizing the source of her luxury was gone forever. "But that is not even the best part," I said softly, ensuring the microphone picked up every single crisp syllable. "Last week, you took out a $40,000 commercial loan for your fake real estate flip. You needed a guarantor with perfect credit to secure the capital, so you forged my signature on the application and you faked a digital notary stamp." Thomas froze completely. His breathing stopped. His eyes widened to the size of saucers as the reality of his actions finally crashed down upon him. Submitting a forged signature to a federally insured financial institution via electronic transfer constitutes bank fraud and wire fraud. I explained calmly, reciting the exact legal statutes my ruthless attorney had outlined for me. It is a severe federal felony carrying decades in federal prison. I picked up the manila folder and handed him the final devastating document. It was the commercial promissory note bearing the official transfer seals of the regional bank. And yesterday afternoon, I delivered the final fatal blow without a single ounce of mercy. My corporate proxy firm purchased that exact commercial loan from your bank at a premium. They were absolutely thrilled to offload your high-risk, toxic debt to an anonymous buyer, which means I legally own your commercial loan. I am your sole absolute primary creditor. And because you violated the core covenants of the lending agreement by committing federal bank fraud, I am calling the debt in full, effective immediately. You don't own me, Thomas. I own you. Thomas stared at the paper in his trembling hands. His entire body began to shake violently. The papers rattled like dry leaves in a winter storm. He looked around the room, desperately searching for an ally, searching for someone to defend him or tell him this was a nightmare. But his family and friends were staring at him with absolute unmasked revulsion. The wealthy business partners he had tried to impress were already standing up and stepping away from their tables, eager to distance themselves entirely from a man confessing to a federal crime in public. I own your debts. I own the tangible evidence of your federal crimes, and I own the house you sleep in, I said. The words tasted like absolute intoxicating freedom. You have 30 days to vacate my property before I have you forcibly evicted and your belongings thrown onto the lawn by the county sheriff. And I strongly suggest you spend that limited time finding a very good criminal defense attorney, because my legal team is handing the forged documents over to the federal authorities on Monday morning. I did not wait for his response. I did not need to. He was completely broken, a hollow, humiliated shell of a man staring down into the terrifying abyss of his own creation. I turned my back on him without a second thought. I picked up my structured leather briefcase from the floor. I looked at Barbara, who was hyperventilating into her cloth napkin, and Jessica, who was staring blankly at the ruined papers scattered across the floor. "Happy birthday, Barbara," I said politely. "I hope you enjoyed the prime rib tonight. I paid for it." I walked down the center aisle of the banquet hall with my head held incredibly high. The massive crowd parted for me, immediately stepping aside as if I were untouchable royalty. Nobody said a single word. Nobody tried to stop me or defend this family I was leaving behind. The silence was absolute, save for the crisp, rhythmic clicking of my leather heels against the hardwood floor. I pushed through the heavy double doors of the country club, stepping out into the cool, fresh evening air. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sweet scent of rain and ultimate liberation. For 8 long years, I had carried the suffocating weight of a toxic, ungrateful man, and tonight I had finally dropped him for good. The heavy mahogany doors of the Oak Bridge Country Club swung shut behind me, cutting off the chaotic sounds of the banquet hall. I stepped out into the cool evening air and took a deep breath. The suffocating humidity of the day had finally broken, leaving the night crisp and remarkably clear. For the first time in 8 long years, my shoulders were completely relaxed. I did not stay in that lavish room to witness the immediate physical fallout of my announcement, but the precise details of their absolute destruction were relayed to me days later by the very people Barbara had invited to witness her grand triumph. When the sheer magnitude of my public declaration finally sank in, the arrogant color drained completely from Thomas's face. He stood frozen at the head of the long dining table, holding the heavy commercial promissory note in his shaking hands. The confident, swaggering real estate tycoon had evaporated in a matter of seconds. In his place stood a terrified hollow man who had just realized he forged his own financial and legal death warrant. And then there was the 24-year-old mistress. She had been seated near the back of the banquet room, invited as a supposed friend of the family to quietly share in the celebration of the wealth she believed she was about to inherit. When I exposed my actual income and revealed the inescapable legal trap snapping shut around Thomas, her eyes went wide with pure, unfiltered panic. She looked across the crystal glasses and floral arrangements at the man she had been kissing on a luxury hotel terrace just days before. She did not see a brilliant visionary about to sweep her away to a downtown penthouse. She saw a broke, desperate fraud who was about to lose everything he owned and drag her directly down into the wreckage with him. According to the country club guests sitting at her table, she stood up from her chair the exact moment the heavy wooden doors closed behind me. She did not hesitate for a single second. She picked up her expensive designer clutch and walked straight toward the main exit. Thomas saw her moving rapidly through the bewildered crowd. He dropped the forged bank documents onto his dinner plate and lunged forward, desperately calling her name over the loud murmurs of the guests. He reached out to grab her arm, begging her to wait, and promising he could fix the financial situation. She yanked her arm out of his grasp with open disgust. She looked him up and down and let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed across the silent room. She told him to lose her number and walked out of the country club, leaving him entirely alone to face his ruined family. The social execution of Barbara and Jessica was equally swift and completely devastating. Barbara collapsed back into her velvet dining chair, clutching her chest. Her perfect, meticulously crafted social reputation was incinerating in real time. The wealthy country club friends she had spent years trying to impress were staring at her with unmasked revulsion. These were people who valued reputation and strict discretion above all else. Watching a family tear itself apart over stolen emergency funds and fake real estate empires was entirely beneath them. One by one, the influential guests stood up from their tables. They did not say goodbye. They did not thank Barbara for the expensive prime rib dinner. They simply gathered their coats and walked silently out the door. Jessica tried to stop a few of them, frantically apologizing and claiming it was all a massive misunderstanding, but they brushed past her without a single glance of sympathy. Within 20 minutes, the lavish banquet hall was completely empty except for Thomas, Barbara, and Jessica sitting among the ruins of their shattered illusions. The waiters cleared the untouched dessert plates in awkward silence, while the three of them stared at the black folders I had left behind, realizing that their endless pipeline of stolen wealth was permanently closed. The drive back to my house that evening was the most profoundly peaceful journey of my entire adult life. The heavy weight of marital obligation, the endless tiptoeing around his fragile ego, the quiet desperation of paying off hidden credit cards, it was all entirely gone. I walked into my quiet home and locked the front door. The house belonged to me. The equity belonged to me. The future belonged to me. Thomas did not come home that night. I did not expect him to. I had nowhere to hide his deep shame and absolutely no money to rent a hotel room now that I had frozen his access to the joint emergency accounts. The following week was a masterclass in aggressive legal strategy. I sat in my attorney's office looking out at the sprawling city skyline while a team of highly trained paralegals executed the final stages of our tactical plan. We attacked the Harding family's fragile defenses with absolute surgical precision. We did not give Thomas a single moment to catch his breath or attempt to manipulate the narrative. We severed every possible lifeline he might try to grab. Thomas tried calling my cell phone dozens of times over the weekend, leaving desperate crying voicemails begging for a second chance. I forwarded every single recording directly to my legal team and changed my personal phone number entirely. Exactly 7 days after the disastrous birthday party, the heavy hammer of legal justice finally dropped. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when the designated process server located Thomas. He was not sitting in a corner office closing complex commercial real estate deals. He was not touring imported Italian tiles for his next massive property flip. He was sitting on a sagging floral sofa in his mother's cramped basement, staring blankly at a concrete wall. When the doorbell rang upstairs, Barbara answered it, expecting a sympathy gift or a package delivery. Instead, she was greeted by a uniformed court officer holding a thick stack of sealed manila envelopes. The process server marched down the basement stairs and handed Thomas 3 separate legal packets. The first heavy envelope contained the formal divorce petition. It was a ruthless, comprehensive document. It claimed absolute legal ownership of my corporate assets, my personal bank accounts, and the house I had purchased long before the marriage began. It explicitly rejected any responsibility for the massive debts Thomas had accumulated through his fraudulent shell companies. The petition made it perfectly clear that he was walking away from our 8-year marriage with absolutely nothing except the clothes currently hanging in his closet. The second envelope contained a formal court-ordered eviction notice. Because the house was solely in my name, and he possessed no legal standing as a tenant or a financial contributor, he was officially ordered to remove his belongings from my property within 30 days. If he attempted to enter the house without a police escort, he would be arrested immediately for trespassing. I had already hired a professional moving company to box up his cheap suits and meaningless possessions. They delivered the cardboard boxes straight to Barbara's front porch later that afternoon. The locks on my house had already been changed, and the security system had been completely upgraded. But it was the third envelope that completely destroyed his remaining grip on reality. This was not a standard family court document. It was a formal civil lawsuit for financial fraud, accompanied by a notification that all gathered forensic evidence had been officially submitted to the federal authorities. The documents detailed his unauthorized wire transfers, the creation of his deceptive holding company, and the exact undeniable timeline of his financial theft. At the very center of the packet was the high-resolution scan of the forged commercial loan guarantee. When Thomas read the printed pages, his hands began to shake violently. The arrogant, sneering expression he had worn for 8 years vanished entirely. The legal documents outlined the exact federal statutes he had violated when he forged my signature and transmitted the false application to a federally insured regional bank. My attorney had explicitly highlighted the severe potential consequences of his actions. Thomas was not just drowning in a massive ocean of unpayable commercial debt. He is drowning in debt and facing potential jail time. The crushing gravity of his actions finally knocked the breath right out of his lungs. He realized that manipulating a loving, accommodating wife was one thing, but defrauding the United States banking system was a catastrophic mistake he could never charm his way out of. His entire fabricated existence collapsed into the damp concrete walls of his mother's dark basement. He had spent his entire adulthood demanding luxury and extreme deference. He had demanded imported materials for houses he did not own, and premium cuts of meat paid for by a woman he openly despised. Now he was sleeping on a worn-out basement mattress, listening to the loud humming of a water heater. He had no customized vehicle to drive. He had no secret allowance to fund expensive dinners at the country club. His former business partners actively refused to take his calls, terrified that any public association with a man under federal fraud investigation would ruin their own corporate reputations. He was entirely isolated and completely bankrupt. Without the weekly transfers of my stolen money, their luxurious country club lifestyle evaporated overnight. Barbara could no longer afford the exorbitant monthly membership dues or the expensive dining minimums. When she attempted to show up for her regular Tuesday afternoon bridge game, the club manager quietly but firmly asked her to leave the premises until her outstanding balances were settled in full. The wealthy friends she had spent decades trying to impress suddenly forgot her name. The elegant invitations to charity galas and upscale dinner parties completely stopped arriving in her mailbox. She was socially exiled, forced to stay inside her modest suburban home, with the curtains drawn tight to hide from the judgment of her gossiping neighbors. Jessica fared no better in the brutal aftermath. The designer clothes and expensive spa weekends she had relentlessly paraded in front of me were entirely gone. She was forced to return her leased luxury vehicle because she could no longer make the massive monthly payments without her brother's secret financial pipeline. When her wealthy tennis friends asked why she had stopped attending their high-end shopping trips, she had to invent pathetic excuses about embracing a more minimalist lifestyle. But everyone in their elite social circle already knew the absolute truth. The story of the disastrous birthday party and the stolen money had spread through their community like wildfire. Jessica and Barbara were no longer the elegant ladies of leisure they had aggressively pretended to be. They were publicly exposed as greedy, entitled parasites who had eagerly lived off the stolen labor of a woman they had treated like garbage. The irony of the entire situation was absolute and incredibly satisfying. Thomas had stood in my home office towering over my desk and promised me that if he left, I would die broke in a miserable, roach-infested apartment. He had laughed at my supposed weakness and claimed he was the only thing standing between me and total poverty. Now he was the one trapped in a dark, cramped basement, jumping at every unexpected knock on the front door, terrified that federal agents had finally come to arrest him. He was drowning under the crushing weight of $40,000 in defaulted commercial loans, massive attorney fees he could not afford to pay, and the utter destruction of his fabricated identity. It is a crisp Saturday morning, exactly 6 months since the day I stood in that country club and dismantled the greatest lie of my life. I am sitting on the back stone patio of my home, the exact same house Thomas tried to steal from me. Now it feels entirely and unequivocally mine. I am holding a warm mug of dark roast coffee, watching the early morning sunlight filter through the branches of the old oak trees in my backyard. There is no one demanding a hot breakfast. There is no one pacing the hardwood floors, complaining about their fabricated business stresses. There is no one criticizing the grocery budget or telling me to tighten my belt. There is only the gentle sound of the morning wind and the absolute unbroken peace of a life completely reclaimed. For 8 long years, I lived as a financial ghost in my own home. I wore faded sweatpants and hid my massive corporate income under generic spreadsheets. I pretended to be small so my husband could feel tall. I am not hiding anymore. Last month, I formally restructured my fractional consultancy firm. I dropped the disguise of the struggling freelance bookkeeper and took on the official title of Chief Executive Officer. I moved my daily workspace out of that cramped spare bedroom and leased a beautiful light-filled office space in the downtown financial district. I threw away the cheap clothes I bought to maintain my cover story and purchased a tailored designer wardrobe that actually reflects my professional standing. I spent 3 weeks this past summer traveling through the south of France. I drank incredibly expensive wine. I took private walking tours through historic vineyards, and I paid for the entire luxurious trip, using the exact same corporate accounts Thomas had completely failed to drain. I am living loudly proud and completely unapologetically. Sometimes, usually, when the house is this quiet, I think back to the woman I used to be. I think about the incredible lengths I went to just to protect a deeply insecure man from his own disastrous failures. It is a strange and heavy realization to finally understand that you spent nearly a decade actively funding your own emotional captivity. Thomas was a man who desperately needed me to be weak so he could feel strong. He required my financial struggle to validate his fake success, and I handed it to him without a fight. I willingly placed my massive achievements into a tiny, suffocating box and handed him the key. I truly believed that shrinking myself was an act of profound marital devotion. I thought making myself invisible was the ultimate proof of my love. It was not love at all. It was a hostage situation disguised as a marriage. We are often taught as women to compromise. We are told to lift our partners up, to smooth over their rough edges, and to bear the heavy weight of their fragile egos with a quiet, accommodating smile. But there is a massive difference between supporting a partner in a true team and sacrificing your entire identity to keep a parasite comfortable. You cannot build a healthy, respectful partnership with someone who views your success as a direct personal threat to their own existence. The exact moment you feel the need to dim your own light, just so a fragile partner does not feel blinded, you have already lost the relationship. The most valuable lesson I took away from the total wreckage of my marriage is this: never let your loyalty become a weapon they use to destroy you. Loyalty is a beautiful and noble trait, but when it is given blindly to someone who only values you for what they can extract from your bank account or your spirit, it becomes pure poison. I was fiercely loyal to a man who was actively plotting my absolute bankruptcy and laughing about it with a younger woman. I will never make that terrible mistake again. My loyalty now belongs entirely to myself, to my peace of mind, and to my wildly successful future. I know there are people listening to my voice right now who understand exactly what that kind of suffocating toxic loyalty feels like. If you have ever had to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's ego, you know exactly how heavy that weight is. Have you ever had a partner underestimate you? Have you ever sat in total silence while someone else claimed all the credit for the very foundation you built with your own two hands and your own hard work? It is an exhausting and miserable way to live. And I am here to tell you that you do not have to live that way for a single second longer. You have the absolute power to stop writing the checks, to stop apologizing for your brilliance, and to permanently walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. I want to hear your stories of survival and strength. I want to build a community of people who have reclaimed their power and their peace. Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single comment, and I find so much power in the experiences we all share. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that the best revenge is massive, undeniable success. You deserve to live a beautiful life where you never have to hide your greatness from anyone. Thank you for listening to my journey, and I will see you in the next story.